Okay, well, welcome. We're really pleased to have you here. My name is Susan Stokes. I am the director of the Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies at Yale. We are a co-sponsor of this event, and we're very pleased to be able to hold it. I just wanted to say a few words of gratitude to the Macmillan Center at Yale, which has generously funded our work and this conference. Thanks to the Yale Law School for this wonderful venue. Thank you very much to Danielle Juarez, who is our staff coordinator at CLICE and who is tireless and carries off unbelievable numbers of events and just does a great job. Thank you as well to the main kind of instigators of this event, Stuart Schwartz, professor in our history department, and Maria Jordano Arroyo. Maria is going to, I'm going to turn things over to her in a minute. She's going to give introductions, so my job is to introduce the introducer. Many of you know her. She is a senior lecturer in Yale's Department of Spanish and Portuguese and a lecturer in the Department of History here at Yale. She's a former associate master, I think we now call them heads, of Ezra Stiles College, which is a residential college here at Yale. And she doesn't have any gray hairs, but if she did, it would be because of her years at Ezra Stiles. Maria was educated at the University of Puerto Rico and has a master's and PhD degrees from the University of Minnesota. Although her research and publication has concentrated on the Golden Age Spain, she's maintained a very deep and profound interest in her native Puerto Rico, the culture, politics, and social conditions of Puerto Rico. And she's been absolutely instrumental in planning this event, and so I'm going to turn things over to her. Thank you, Maria.
Ready? Okay. As a Puerto Rican and a member of the Yale faculty, I want to welcome everyone, and especially our guests from Puerto Rico. This event was conceived as a way to establish a dialogue with scholars and professionals of different fields to help us understand the present economic crisis of Puerto Rico, the context that generated it, and the role of the Fiscal Oversight Board, created and imposed by the government of the United States under the law so-called PROMESA. This entity has complete powers over the fiscal and economic affairs of the island, and its proposed drastic austerity fiscal measures have dramatically unveiled the continuing colonial status of Puerto Rico. Our speakers will examine the social, legal, and political repercussions of this imposition, and the negative effects that the implementation of these measures will have on the population. Hopefully, our discussions will move us to speculate about the future destiny of the Puerto Ricans at a moment that many of us perceive as a crucial moment in the history of our country, given the unrest, dislocation, discomfort, and in many cases, tragedy created by these plans. It is my hope and my sincere desire that this dialogue will not end here and will carry far beyond these walls. I would also like to express my thanks to the Macmillan Center, to the Center for the Latin American Studies, and to the Yale Law School for their joint sponsorship in this roundtable. Especially to Susan Stokes, to Danielle Juarez, to Tricia Connelly, Marilyn Wicks, and my stepson Lee Schwartz, who designed the poster of the event. Thank you so much. And now I'm gonna briefly do the introduction of the moderator of the panel. It's Danielle Gutierrez, that she was a great support all this time, and she helped me in all the different details through more than 2 months, I will say. Danielle received a PhD in history from the University of Puerto Rico, where she won the Medal of High Academic Distinction in 2012. She's currently teaching writing at Princeton University. She has published in a number of distinguished history journals, and she will be, this coming summer, a visiting fellow at Harvard University. So, welcome to everybody.
Good afternoon. It is an absolute privilege to serve as moderator of an island under siege, Puerto Rico's current financial, political, and human rights crisis. I dare to speak for today's panelists to also express their sense of profound gratitude. Nonetheless, even though this sense of appreciation does have much to do with the provision of an academic space, a safe academic space, to have such a complex conversation. This gratitude does not only emerge from academic inquiry. Even though we're all invested in an ongoing search for meaning as scholars and communicators, our presentations have a thread that is more urgent and compelling: deep indignation. As the Oversight Board situates itself as a source of authority in the island, Puerto Ricans seem to be under siege by affirmative acts that have historically belittled their right to political representation and deliberately augmented their fiscal responsibility under the ruse of austerity. Our invited speakers today have another thing in common. We all share a story with La Universidad de Puerto Rico. When these roundtable discussions were first conceived, we could have not envisioned the circumstances that would be contextualizing our contributions today. Exactly a week ago, the Oversight Board was in an air-conditioned convention center, condescendingly hearing proposals of academic development, while outside, the students of the University of Puerto Rico held a protest under the sun, standing against the $450 million budget cut that would affect its accreditation and would be fatal to its long narrative of intellectual production and social dissent. Today, the University of Puerto Rico is still paralyzed by an ongoing strike that started 2 days ago, a struggle to hold on to some sense of Puerto Rican agency. These two fronts encompass the crux of the divergences we will be analyzing today. While a second session will look at the crisis from the lenses of intellectual history, political history, and economic projections, this first roundtable discussion will concentrate on looking at this vortex from 3 angles. First, we will explore the constitutional history that precedes and fuels the terms and conditions of the Puerto Rico Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act, also known as PROMESA. Next, we will survey local media representation of the crisis. Lastly, we will ponder on the human rights implications of the Oversight Board. Each paper presentation will last approximately 20 minutes. After all presentations, there will be time for questions and answers. Our first presenter is Dr. Efren Rivera Ramos. Rivera Ramos is a full professor and former dean of the University of Puerto Rico Law School, recipient of the Deborah Pro Bono and Public Service of the American Association of Law Schools and the Haywood Burns and Shonara Gilbert Award from the Northeastern People of Color Conference. He has been a visiting professor at Yale University, the University of Ottawa, Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, and University of Barcelona. His vast publication record on the constitutional history of Puerto Rico has led him to participate in special commissions of the Supreme Court of Puerto Rico and to serve as a consultant of the Conflict Prevention and Peace Forum of the Social Science Research Council and the Political Department of the United Nations. This inquest within the convoluted constitutional history of Puerto Rico is today's presentation, titled Brief Historical Review of the Constitutional Relationship Between the U.S. and
Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for attending this conference on a topic that is so very close to the heart of our society. And I think that, as Daniel said, it's a very important topic. And I think that, as Daniel said, it's a very close to the heart of our society. And I think that, our intellectual concerns and for our passions. I want to thank the organizers for setting up this program and for inviting me to participate in this panel. I am especially happy to return to Haven at VA Law School, where I had such a wonderful time as a visiting professor some years ago, and where I still have so many dear friends. One of them is here around. We have been asked to address the current fiscal crisis in Puerto Rico, which, as has been said, among other things, has led to the establishment by the U.S. Congress of a fiscal oversight board that has taken over the control of Puerto Rico's fiscal and budgetary affairs. The fiscal crisis of Puerto Rico has many dimensions. It involves historical, constitutional, political, economic, social, and human rights considerations. It touches on both law and policy. Since in held this afternoon, there will be other speakers who will address in more detail many of those issues. I have decided to dedicate my initial comments this afternoon to providing a very succinct, and I underline succinct, summary of the constitutional relationship between the United States in order to put in context the adoption of the so-called PROMESA legislation that created the Oversight Board and its reception in Puerto Rico. In the early years of the 20th century, the Supreme Court of the United States determined that Puerto Rico should be considered what it called an unincorporated territory of the United States. The court also affirmed that territories such as Puerto Rico were subject to what it called the plenary powers of Congress under the territorial clause of the United States Constitution. And that clause, called the territorial clause, reads, and I quote, "The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States." End of quote. I'll read it again. I like to read it. It reminds us of so many things. It has so many connotations. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. End of quote. Now, what is this plenary power that Congress exercises over the territories? First, the concept means that Congress has exclusive power to take fundamental decisions regarding the condition of the territories. Second, plenary powers are general powers of government, in contrast to the limited powers that Congress may exercise over the states. In other words, Congress can exert over the territory power that it could not exercise over the states. That is why Congress can adopt a law like PROMESA to govern fiscal, budgetary, and other key aspects of the government of Puerto Rico, something it cannot do for the states. Thirdly, there is a sense of plenary elaborated by Associate Justice John Marshall Harlan in a 1907 case called Grafton v. U.S. Harlan wrote that one of the differences between a territory and a state is that the government of a state does not derive its powers from the United States, whereas the government of a territory like Puerto Rico owes its existence wholly to the United States. Harlan said, and I quote, "The jurisdiction and authority of the United States over that territory and its inhabitants for all legitimate purpose of government is paramount." End of quote. Now, it was in the exercise of its plenary powers that Congress extended U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans in 1917, that it permitted Puerto Ricans to elect our own governor in 1947, that it allowed Puerto Rico to draft its own constitution in 1950, and Congress approved with amendments the Puerto Rican Constitution of 1952. Under its plenary power, in 1976, Congress passed Section 936 of the U.S. Internal Revenue Code to provide tax exemptions to U.S. firms operating in Puerto Rico, giving the Puerto Rican economy a boost in the following year. And under that very same plenary power, in 1996, Congress eliminated Section 936, causing an economic jolt in the territory whose consequences are felt to this day. It has been by virtue of its plenary power under the territorial clause that Congress has placed caps on the social and welfare programs that it makes available to Puerto Rico, such as Medicare and Medicaid, providing for fewer benefits than those accessible to residents of the states. Congress can do that, and it has done that. To be sure, all those actions have had significant long-term effects on Puerto Rico's political and economic life. And some of those historians are closely tied to diverse aspects of the crisis. After the adoption of the 1952 Constitution and the proclamation of the so-called Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, many in Puerto Rico entertained the idea that something in the relationship and Puerto Rico had fundamentally changed, that the latter, Puerto Rico, had ceased to be a mere territory of the U.S. Then came June. What happened in June of 2016? That month, the U.S. Supreme Court decided two cases that have been viewed by most people in Puerto Rico as a severe to the current Commonwealth status. One of those cases is known as Commonwealth v. Sanchez Valle, in which the court concluded that Puerto Rico had not become a sovereign entity for purposes of the double jeopardy clause of the U.S. Constitution. Now, the double jeopardy clause protects a person from being prosecuted twice for the same offense, except if the prosecutions are conducted by different Puerto Rico. The majority opinion in Sanchez Valle likened Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States to that between a municipality and the state that has granted the municipality its charter. So Puerto Rico is to the federal government what a city or a town is to the state that created the city and the town. It is not the same as a relationship between a state and the federal government. That's what it means. Now, the important thing is that in order to reach its conclusion, the court emphasized the role that Congress played in the enactment of the Constitution of Puerto Rico, because Congress authorized its adoption, amended Constitution approved by the Puerto Rican people in significant ways, and finally stamped its final approval on the text. So that was the role that Congress played. That's the role that the court underlines as being dispositive of the question that it had to resolve in that case. In a telling statement, the court added that, and I quote, "One power Congress does not have, just in the nature of things. It has no capacity, no magic wand or airbrush to erase or otherwise rewrite its own foundational role in conferring political authority. Or otherwise said, the delegator, Congress, cannot make itself any less so, no matter how much authority it opts to hand over." End of quote. In other words, by acting to authorize Puerto Rico to draft its own constitution, Congress was not relinquishing its powers under the territorial clause. It reserved those powers. In fact, according to the court, Congress could not relinquish its powers. The implication then is that Puerto Rico, despite 1952, is still to be considered a territory of the U.S. and, per definition, subject to the plenary powers of Congress under that clause of the Constitution. Now, 4 days later, after that case was decided, the Supreme Court decided another case, Commonwealth v. Franklin, that also had to do with Puerto Rico. The case arose out of the following circumstances. Puerto Rico had always been included in Chapter 9 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, which basically authorizes states to, in turn, authorize its municipalities and instrumentalities to file for bankruptcy in federal court under Chapter 9. Puerto Rico had always been included in that because it had always been defined as a state for that purpose. But in 1984, without explanation, Congress excluded Puerto Rico from the benefits of Chapter 9 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, which meant that it was not authorized, Puerto Rico was not authorized to authorize its instrumentalities and municipalities to take advantage of the provisions of Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code. Now, in light of that exclusion, and in response to the current fiscal crisis, in 2014, Puerto Rico adopted its own bankruptcy law because it could not avail itself of the federal bankruptcy law. A group of creditors challenged that Puerto Rican law. And finally, the U.S. Supreme Court found in favor of the challengers, deciding that although Congress had excluded Puerto Rico from Chapter 9, Puerto Rico was still bound by that statute's provision from adopting their own debt restructuring statutes to force non-consenting creditors to accept the terms of such adjustments. In other words, Puerto Rico could not avail itself of Chapter 9 and could not pass its own law to remedy that deficiency. So Puerto Rico found itself between a rock and a hard place. Now, the majority opinion in that case does not address any constitutional issues, such as the question of Puerto Rico's political status. It doesn't do that expressly. But, as it usually happens, the court proceeds under several constitutional assumptions. One such assumption is that Congress may properly exclude Puerto Rico from the benefits of Chapter 9. And of course, the only reason it can do so is because of its plenary powers under the territorial clause. Now, 4 days after the Sanchez Valle decision, and the very same day the Franklin decision was rendered, Congress enacted PROMESA. So the very same day, the court decided Franklin, and that day, Congress enacted PROMESA. What is PROMESA? Apart from a perverse irony on the part of the drafters of the statute. Apart from that, what is PROMESA? It is a federal statute that basically does three things. It creates the so-called Oversight and Management Board to control Puerto Rico's fiscal and budgetary affairs. The board's 7 members are appointed by the president, 6 of them by recommendation of the majority and minority leadership of the U.S. Congress, and 1 chosen by the president itself. Now remember, Puerto Rico does not vote for the president, and Puerto Rico does not elect voting members to Congress, voting representatives in Congress. So that's the first thing that PROMESA does. It creates this board. I'll talk about it a little more. Or the rule or regulation is somehow incompatible with the fiscal plan that the board itself has authorized. The board may require that all of the Puerto Rican government's contracts and financial transactions be submitted to it for its prior approval. So if the board decides so, the Puerto Rican government could not enter into any contract or enter into any transaction, financial transaction without the board's prior approval. The board may make recommendations to the Puerto Rican government on a wide variety of organizational and operational matters, with the requirement that if those recommendations are not adopted by the Puerto Rican government, then the government has to provide an explanation of its reasons to the board, to the President of the U.S., and to the U.S. Congress. The government is required to submit quarterly reports to the board on the implementation of the certified fiscal plans and the budget, and the board has the power to require adjustments to either the plan or the budget if it finds that the government is not operating in compliance with either. Okay? The board has many other powers specified in the law that also illustrate the tremendous amount of power that this entity has been endowed with by the PROMESA legislation. PROMESA, in fact, displaces or suspends numerous provisions of the Constitution of Puerto Rico. It is nothing less, the board is nothing less than a super government composed of non-elected functionaries operating over and above the duly elected government of Puerto Rico. That's what PROMESA is about, basically, and that's what the board is about. Now, what is especially relevant to this brief historical review is that PROMESA expressly establishes that the act has been enacted pursuant to Congress's powers under the territorial clause of the U.S. Constitution. If anyone had entertained any doubts about the territorial nature of Puerto Rico's government and the extent of congressional power over it, Congress has unequivocally dispelled those doubts on the heels of the Sanchez Valle and the Franklin cases. That's why those three events are related, those two cases and the enactment of PROMESA. And this may explain, to some extent, the negative reaction to PROMESA by many sectors of Puerto Rican society, like the students, who view PROMESA and the Oversight Board as another colonial imposition that belies contemporary democratic values, impinges upon the human rights of Puerto Rico's most vulnerable populations, and undermines Puerto Rico's very right to self-determination. If you have any questions, I will gladly address them during the discussion period. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Joana Isabel Gonzalez. Gonzalez is a journalist for the business section of El Nuevo Día and has earned a master's degree in communications from the University of Puerto Rico. During her 20-year journalistic career, she has arduously reported on the transformations and downturns of Puerto Rico's recent economic history. Her work has been recognized by Puerto Rican business organizations, the Overseas Press Club, and Spain's IE Business School. Her determination toward casting light into Puerto Rico's economic crisis frames her presentation, titled "The Story That Many Refuse to Believe: Puerto Rico's Economic and Institutional Decay and the Role of Local Media in Unveiling the Crisis."
Thank you, Danielle. Thank
Make
you
your
so
computer easier to use. Windows delete and cancel.
Yeah, Daniel just left and he has his password. I don't have his password.
Any Yale password.
No, we have to switch users though, because he's logged in on his personal account.
let's proceed. And
Do you want to go to that?
of course, it's okay.
It's going to be a complement of your presentation. So
I know. Don't worry.
Adelante.
It's okay. Well, good afternoon to all. Thank you so much, Professor Jordan, your colleagues at the center, for organizing this event, and certainly for allowing me to share my thoughts. I've been writing about this crisis for so long, I think. So it's nice to share my thoughts, although I would say that they're not necessarily the views or the opinions of El Nuevo Día or the GFR Media, which is the media or the newspaper I work for. I would say that Puerto Rico is insolvent. In fact, Puerto Rico has been insolvent for nearly a decade. No, it's over there, and this is the keyboard. Okay, sorry. But you could go on. Of course, of course. As I was saying, Puerto Rico is insolvent. It's been insolvent for nearly a decade, I would say. Facts point to it. But people learn about it maybe.
Make your computer easier to use.
Okay.
This is God talking.
Okay, we're good. Okay. Please. Yes. Oops. Okay. I think that we got it. Okay. As I was saying, some people learned about Puerto Rico crisis in 2013. There was this publication. I mean, this Barnes is a very respected publication within the financial world, and suddenly our crisis was somehow summarized in that story. Some of it happened because Detroit went bankrupt, and people started wondering if there was another issuer within the municipal market that could face the same challenges. And that somehow wasn't heard by many. And 3 years after, other people learned about Puerto Rico crisis when President Barack Obama and Congress, of course, passed Promesa. And that was what the former President Obama said when he enacted the bill. When they did that, by the same time, the White House released some kind of a fact sheet about Promesa. And if you read it, it would say things like, we won't see any layoffs within the government. The board is not allowed to take the powers of elected officials and so on. I won't go into that because I'm a reporter and I'm just trying to stick to the facts. Well, now, this is where we are. There are 23 days for the end of Promesa's stay. When Promesa was approved, it allowed all kind of litigations to stay until the parties, meaning the government and creditors, could reach an agreement. But that period to try to strike a deal, as people say within the financial world, it's running short. So we're just 23 days away from the end of Promesa's stay. That happens in May 1st. What will happen? Well, there's already about a dozen lawsuits filed against the government of Puerto Rico. And as I said, plaintiffs, which are creditors, they're asking for several remedies or reliefs. They're asking things like to revert the way public funds have been used since the default last year. And they're also asking for things like nullifying a specific law, moratorium law, which was the one that allowed for the government to default. What I see there, or what are you seeing there, it's something that is extremely close to what will happen in the court. We have right now all these lawsuits that are pending. Creditors are waiting for their money. But there's an issue. There's no money at the Treasury account. And that's the forecast. What we are seeing there is precisely how the government is running short out of money. This is, by the way, I think that it started right at this week, and it would go till June 30th. I don't see too many columns in the upside. I think that it's mostly negative. So the government, according to the own own government figures and the certified plan, Puerto Rico government would be in red by $279 million next June. But that amount of money does not include other things, like the debt that we hasn't paid in 2 years. That's about $2 billion. And it doesn't include the fact that the government of Puerto Rico will need to pay for pensions starting next June. It doesn't include either the amount of money that Puerto Rico will lose once Obamacare funds are extinguished next October. So I don't want to be rude, but the truth is that Puerto Rico needs ASAP at least $2 billion in cash just to keep things rolling. As you see there are not too many options. Why the government of Puerto Rico will start paying pensions? Well, you're seeing there the current state of the teachers' retirement system. Those teachers, they don't receive any other income because they don't contribute to Social Security. And you'll see in there the public employee retirement system assets. As you see, both of them are nearly depleted, or in fact, they're gonna be depleted just in a couple of months. In the case of the public retirement system, that would be short in June. Teacher retirement systems will run out of cash by next February February 2018, I think. So with this situation, the Oversight Board said we have a business or a financial solution. This is the figures. We're talking about a financial problem, and the board is providing a financial solution. And I want to make that clear because I know that the saddest part of this public discussion and all these debate is that there's a human side. That's the side we've been writing over and over and over again. But that tragedy, in fact, is being handled as a financial matter. We're dealing with creditors. Creditors are asking for money. And the government would like to provide services, but at the very end, they don't have enough money to do so. I know that it's rude, but that's how it's been played. The board was very clear last January when the board said that Puerto Rico had to make a correction of its finances, and even though if the Puerto Rico government goes ahead with a fiscal plan, it won't have money to pay creditors. Puerto Rico is supposed to pay creditors about $4 billion a year. According to the plan, to the certified plan, the board allowed for that purpose only $800 million. And that is really important because although many people are saying that the board, it's only here to ensure that creditors get paid, it makes you wonder how this is going to unfold, because at the very end, the board is also asking a very, very important sacrifice to creditors. And in fact, they are the ones who have plenty of resources to challenge PROMESA and to challenge the fiscal plan. Not necessarily the people, not the citizens, but the creditors. They will have all the resources, and they will make sure that that 800 million figure goes up once they go to court. Some people think that creditors should bear the cost. That's what we've been seeing all over again. In every corner of Puerto Rico, you would see something like that. Because people don't believe that this is going to happen. People are refusing for these, and it seems inevitable so far. Maybe we're going to write something different in a couple of weeks, but still, we don't know that yet. That's the recipe. The board is asking for a combination of revenues and government cuts. That is about $1.3 billion in revenue measures and cuts for $2.6 billion. And that should happen in a 3-year span. When you look at it, only the cuts that we represent, and I know that there's an economist, and maybe I'm not the right person to say this, but that amount of money would represent about 4% of Puerto Rico's gross product. That's what we're talking about. What has happened? How come Puerto Rico is in this situation? How come people didn't know what was going on? Well, for many of us, the crisis has been our daily bread and butter. We've been writing about this for nearly 10 to 11 years. In 2006, right after the government shut down and we got the first rating downgrade, we ran a story talking about what happened to communities, to cities and counties that did not handle their finances well. That's a story talking about the case of Washington, D.C. and the case of Philadelphia. When no one was talking about a fiscal control board, we set the record straight. When no one was talking about what could happen in terms of running short of money, we did run a story. Unfortunately, I think that people refuse to believe. 3 governors told us over and over again that the finances were fixed. This is a story from November 2016, pointing that the deficit, the fiscal imbalances continue, so nothing has been addressed properly. This is something that I think that I won't ever forget this day. That was in 2010. The gentleman over there is Mr. Carlos Garcia. He's one of the current members of the Oversight Board. Then he was chair at the Government Development Bank. He went to the legislator and he said, we were able to arrange this new mechanism through COFINA. They made an amendment. COFINA is an entity that issues debt that is paid with the sales tax. And he warned lawmakers then, and he said, the government of Puerto Rico is going to run out of money. It's going to run out of money, and it's going to be quite soon. I don't know. I think that the place was packed. There were plenty of reporters over there, TV, radio, but I think that no one got the message. As I said, we have never addressed our fiscal imbalances. And for some people, and in some part, it makes sense. Governments not necessarily need to deal with a balanced budget. But when the fiscal cap is a continuous trend, there's no way you can provide services to people if you're not handling your finances properly. That's the story of the general fund. I think that they're there maybe 12 years, always in red. And people won't believe this either. People got a rescue package. The people of Puerto Rico got it. It didn't have that name. But between 2009 and 2011, a lot of things happened in Puerto Rico that maybe were not so significant, or maybe people didn't thought it was important. We had a banking crisis. The FDIC jumped in, supporting with about $8 billion in deposits. We had ARA funds, which was the stimulus package provided by President Obama. That figure was about $6 billion. We also had TARP funds. 2 local banks had access to the program created during the financial crisis. And we also had Obamacare. And the IRS never questioned a new excise tax imposed by the government of Puerto Rico. In the case of the excise tax, that would represent another $6 billion in a 6-year span. And in the case of the ARA funds, it was about $7 billion. Obamacare, nearly $7 billion more. That amount of money has vanished. But when you look at that tremendous amount of money, people who know about these things, what Puerto Rico got in those 4 years, it's similar to what Greece received from the IMF during the first part of the crisis. Still, in 2012, we took a look at the finances of Puerto Rico, and we ran this very, I would say, alarming cover story for our paper, because we're like the paper of record, so we don't try to be too sensationalist. We ran that story, saying, that was in April 2012, saying that Puerto Rico will run out of money by 2015. To my dismay, we made an analysis back then. We told the people how much debt was issued. We had the opportunity of interviewing experts, economists, people who have been following Puerto Rico for a long time, and they all agreed. We were headed to a cul-de-sac. To my dismay, we were right. In July 2015, the government of Puerto Rico defaulted for the very first time of its history by not paying the Public Finance Corporation debt. It's not easy reporting about this. Sometimes one of the reasons it's so difficult is because it's about numbers, or it's about reading hundreds and hundreds of financial statements. Most of the important things are buried in footnotes that only investors, attorneys read because they care about their clients. But the people don't read about these things, and many experts either. So, in fact, our decay, the way the finances were simply tearing apart, was buried within the financial statements. But they're complicated things that citizens are not necessarily familiar with. And another thing is that Puerto Rico is not necessarily too responsible. It seems that it doesn't manage its finances well, but it doesn't comply with regulations either. That fact over there, I think that it's very, very important. For an issuer for a municipal issuer to go and raise capital from the markets, it must comply with certain criteria. One of the things it should comply is to provide its financial statements on a timely basis. Well, Puerto Rico has 305 days after the closing of each fiscal year to do so. Take a look. At first, it didn't go so bad. Look at what happened in 2008, in 2009. Look what happened in 2014. That's how many days you're behind from your required deadline. Right now, Puerto Rico hasn't released any other financial statements since fiscal year 2014. We're missing 2015, 2016, and now 2017. But still, we still have time with that. Some people did pay attention. Some people did see what was going on, and some people, like in the case this very good friend Planeta Quique, and some of his work has been portrayed at 80 grados. He tried to explain people that, in fact, all of these could be explained by something, and that is the economy. Puerto Rico has been contracting constantly. I don't go into detail because there is someone who is going to take care of that. But the truth is that there is no way you can run a government if you cannot raise revenues. And it's very difficult in the case of Puerto Rico. I think that one of the persons who explained that brilliantly is precisely economist Francisco Catalá. One of the reasons the economy is performing so badly is because our entire institutional framework is falling apart. We keep doing things like the way they were done 30 years ago. And we keep promoting policies that didn't result in good benefits for Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico had a lot of tax incentives. And what the government is proposing to reignite the economy, another version of 936. We think that people should buy houses, so we go ahead and we borrow money to create some kind of a bonus so people could buy houses. How people could buy houses if they don't have a job to pay for their mortgages. But we keep doing this. And it's very difficult to do it. It's very difficult to provide good services to the population when only one people who is in working age, one of 4 people at working age is doing so in Puerto Rico. There's no way you can run a government. There's no way you can provide services to the people with such a small base. And I'm going to go quite fast with this. 2 things that were evident and that for some reason people didn't realize is that Puerto Rico went into a very serious financial crisis. As I said, in 2010, three banks failed. That was the third part of the financial system. But it was so important that those failures are among the top 25 largest failures of the 2008 fiscal crisis of the United States, financial crisis. But no one was paying attention. That resulted in tremendous losses. In the case of the shareholders of the banks, they lost about $8 billion. That happened in part because we went through a housing bubble. The housing bubble turned into a bust, and people started losing what they saved. Property values has not recovered since then. There's an example over there. But the saddest part, and I'm gonna finish right now. Okay, yes, is that people are losing their houses every single day. About 10 families lose their homes every single day in Puerto Rico. But no one's pays attention. And I'm gonna leave with this. The governor said, Governor Garcia Padilla said, that he was ready to go ahead and to solve the island crisis. He was the one who lobbied for Promesa, along with entrepreneurs, along with the business community. We ended with a restructuring vehicle, but also with an oversight board, precisely because the government, the solution to the crisis, was providing that mechanism for the people of Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Our final presenter for this session is Ariadna Godreau Aubert. Godreau Aubert is an adjunct professor at the Universidad de Sagrado Corazón in Puerto Rico, has earned a Juris Doctor of the University of Puerto Rico, and is currently pursuing a master's degree in international human rights at the University of Oxford. She has served as coordinator of the Access to Justice Working Group and is a member of the Legal Action Committee, which represents protesters of Promesa. Her master thesis aims to analyze the adequacy of international law to attend to unsustainable debt in colonies. Along that line, today's presentation is titled #People Before Debt, Promesa and the Primacy of Human Rights in the Wake of Austerity.
Thank you. I wanted to start by saying how grateful I am to be here. Thank you to Professor Maria Jordan and for everybody to be here, and to the people that's online following this conference. As Daniel was saying, I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of a human rights lawyer, and I wanted to make that disclosure beforehand. Prior and after the approval of Promesa, I have had the opportunity to collaborate as an activist and a lawyer, participating in popular education efforts, joining anti-Promesa rallies, and providing legal support to protesters against the junta. Lately, I have been studying the public debt from an international human rights perspective, but also as a socio-political and gendered issue, as a continuum of colonialism. Today, I will share some brief reflections on the impact of Promesa and austerity on the social and economic rights of those living in Puerto Rico. I wanted to start by highlighting some key elements for this discussion. First, that according to Promesa, the junta has two main objectives. First, to guarantee the repayment of the debt, and to restore PR's access to financial markets. Although it directly affects labor, health, education, and environmental rights, Promesa never attends to human rights. Mentions of rights, and you can find the word rights in a PDF version and see this. Mention of rights are limited to those of the creditors and to obligations arising from lending contracts. This has led many to sustain that the junta is nothing but a collection agency. Secondly, the loss of democracy places the question of what's in a name in a central position. The junta, the board, is a fiscal control board and not an oversight board. This unelected body has taken over Puerto Rico's budget, public policies, agencies, public corporations, and even the university. And this is important because the distance between oversight and control is proportional to the gap between democracy and colonialism. This is also relevant in human rights terms. By assuming virtually absolute control over Puerto Rico's government, the junta contracted a direct responsibility towards the enjoyment of human rights in the island. That being said, in this presentation, I will argue that, first, Puerto Rico has engaged in a pattern of self-defeating austerity. The crisis did not start or will end with Promesa. This is a crisis rooted in colonialism, inequality, poor economic growth strategies, and in the lack of a nationally defined social protection floor. Two, as many examples illustrate, Promesa jeopardizes social and economic rights by increasing austerity. It challenges the primacy of human rights by prioritizing financial reputation and pacta sunt servanda, debt service, over fundamental guarantees. Third, the Puerto Rico and the U.S. governments have a responsibility to protect, respect, and fulfill the rights of those living in Puerto Rico. And this responsibility extends to private actors, such as creditors, banks, and vulture funds. Fourth, that Puerto Rico's debt crisis requires a human rights-based approach in which principles such as dignity, participation, non-discrimination, transparency, and equitable development are accounted for. This approach also speaks of monitoring accountability, naming those responsible, and access to adequate remedies to those who suffer violations. And lastly, international human rights law must adapt, modify, create, develop forums and remedies suitable for those living in unresolved colonial lands like Puerto Rico. During the past 2 decades, international organizations have developed a framework to assess unsustainability from a human rights perspective. These efforts have been pushed forward by the UN and particularly by the independent expert on the impact of foreign debt in economic and social rights. As Joana Isabel was saying, debt management strategies rarely take human rights into consideration. And as we all know, the U.S. has not ratified most major human rights treaties like ICESCA or CEDAW, and even more, the U.S., as we were talking before coming in here, has opposed on several occasions to the mandate of the independent expert on foreign debt, arguing that debt should not be assessed from a human rights perspective. So most of the principles that I'm going to be discussing here, they are not legally enforceable, but these guidelines are useful to analyze the impact of austerity and Promesa. A human rights-based approach to unsustainable debt provides a comprehensive understanding of austerity and its consequences. This approach accounts for the duty-bearer, right-holder relationships between creditors, the state, and the people. Although when faced with serious economic hardship, a state may have no other option than to downgrade or limit the level of enjoyment of a right, austerity cannot be implemented blindly. To be legitimate, austerity measures must comply with a specific criteria. Austerity measures must be necessary, reasonable, temporary, proportional, non-discriminatory, protect a minimum core of rights, and promote the genuine participation of those affected. The interdependency of rights must also be accounted for. Neither can such adjustment be a means to derive profit and aggravate the inequality by increasing the gap between the rich who become richer because of the crisis and those who become poorer. As Spain and Greece demonstrate, austerity is an ineffective mechanism of economic growth and has detrimental consequences on the rights and living conditions of vulnerable populations. Since 2006, Puerto Rico has experienced aggravated austerity. There was an increase in sale and property taxes and in the cost of essential services. Major layoff plans were implemented, schools were closed, public housing residents evicted, and health services privatized. Meanwhile, the government tailored policies to attract investors, many of them regardless of the consequences for the island populations. Laws such as Law 20 and 22, which will be probably discussed in the next panel, presented Puerto Rico as a tropical tax haven with no passport requirement and cheap labor force. While the scarce money available was being diverted to the debt, more loans were being taken, and soon, even when most of the public expenditure was being destined to health, education, and pensions, the crisis became undeniable. Poor management and lack of accountability led many to consider that it was the government who forged the crisis. As of today, and somehow to respond to who has been paying attention to the crisis, 45.2% of the population lives under poverty. In municipalities like Salinas, this number reaches 60%. Inequality is also increasing. Puerto Rico is the second most unequal place in Latin America, and also second in the US. 81% of children live in high poverty areas, 48% of women and 40% of those 65 years old or older live under poverty. 50% of the population benefits from the public health plan. 1.3 million people receive food stamps. In the last decade, nearly 10% of the population left the island. And contrary to the brain drain myth, between 2006 and 2014, nearly 250,000 of those peoples were poor. The working class is leaving. While statistics are not reliable and do not provide a comprehensive understanding of a human rights crisis, these numbers are telling. Now I wanted to share some examples of the consequences of austerity in three fundamental rights: education, labor, and access to justice. I want to illustrate the already fragile ecosystem in which PROMESA proposes more budget cuts and a debt service-driven plan. Many of these findings were presented before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights last year, and I also incorporated part of the fiscal plan that was just approved by the junta. In regards to education, the public system has been under siege for the past 10 years. Between 2014 and 2016, 177 schools were closed. According to the fiscal plan, 300 more schools are to be closed now in August. While the government justifies these actions by signaling to a reduction of students, parents, teachers, and communities have been denied participation in these decisions even when they could demonstrate that schools had sufficient enrollment, academic achievements, and were in adequate conditions. Many of these shutdowns happened days before the beginning of the semester without prior notification, fostering an atmosphere of uncertainty and vulnerability for these children and their families. The case of special education is particularly disheartening. Between 25 to 30% of the students in Puerto Rico are registered as special education students. While many factors could explain this statistic, it is undeniable that the government has been unable to provide adequate education for thousands of children with diverse mental and physical conditions who lack teachers, therapists, and suitable learning facilities. For the past 35 years, in the Rosalidia versus Departamento de Educación case before the District Court of Puerto Rico, families have been fighting to make the Puerto Rico government fulfill its duty towards the adequate education of these children. Instead, for 10 years, the government has preferred to pay $10,000 daily fine for non-compliance. There is no information in the fiscal plan on what is going to be made with the special education students. The right to labor has also been affected. Major layoffs in the government implemented in the last decade have had direct repercussions in the economy, summing up to the loss of 230,000 jobs in the private and public sectors together. As of today, only 4 out of 10 able Puerto Ricans are active in the labor force. PROMESA promises more precarity for workers. The junta has power to revise labor policies, intervene in collective bargaining agreements, and forbid strikes. The labor reform, approved in February in compliance with the junta's recommendations, includes a reduction in vacation leaves, the extension of probationary periods for new workers, and hinders claims for unfair employment termination. While groups abroad advocate for living wages, under PROMESA, the governor has discretion to lower the minimum wage of those 25 years and younger to $4.25. This amounts to $170 per week before taxes, making Puerto Rico the cheapest labor market within the U.S. This fulfills the demands of private sector coalitions who have for long advocated for lower wages, arguing that the minimum wage hinders economic growth and that it is too high in relation to the skills of the people in Puerto Rico. This will result in increasing poverty, violence, and outmigration. The pension system is also at risk. While both the government and creditors have tried to construct a narrative using pensioners, who are also bondholders, to justify debt service, the sustainability of the pension system is extremely precarious. as of today, 30,000 elders survive on barely $500 or less a month, with 23% of the population being 60 years old or older. PROMESA lack of compromise with the protection of the pension system is of considerable concern. The fiscal plan includes a reduction of 10% in all public pensions. Lastly, and on access to justice, the government is increasingly unable to provide adequate conditions for the exercise of rights inside and outside the courts. Budget cuts in the judicial branch have justified the shutdowns of courts in high poverty areas. Together with a failed public transportation and crime prevention system, this means less access to justice for the poor, domestic violence survivors, elders, and disabled, among others. Free legal services providers have experienced budget costs of 30 to 40%. Eviction and foreclosure cases have been increasing by thousands, and in the majority of these cases, up to 90%, the defendants lack legal representation. Access to justice also means access to remedies. The immunity granted to La Junta in PROMESA is a cause for great concern, as well as the repression of the right to protest. Mobilizations under the slogan People Before Debt has been instrumental to voice opposition to austerity and PROMESA. As Daniel was saying, while we are here, students in the University of Puerto Rico, the only higher public education in Puerto Rico, have declared a systemic strike, protesting the fiscal plan's intended major budget cut to the institution, the imposition of the junta on austerity, and demanding a public audit to the debt. In response, private actors like Walmart, media conglomerates, the Chamber of Commerce, assisted by the government, have attempted to use litigation to prohibit free speech. At this moment, the PR legislature is considering amending the penal code to criminalize protest in education facilities and in construction sites, and also observers and lawyers who, by attempting to mediate, may delay police interventions. The possibility of more frequent scenarios of police brutality in the context of a very slow police reform is a cause of alarm. Colonialism produces vulnerability, shown by the imposition of the junta itself, by domestic restructuring mechanism being struck down, as Efrain was saying. It is also important to know that since 1953, Puerto Rico is not part of the list of colonies, so it's like a double invisibility. Colonialism also produces apathy. While many simplify the junta as another materialization of the colony, for others, it is a chance to get even with ineffective governments and corrupt political parties. Apathy endangers human rights. While the consequences of PROMESA are yet to be seen, it is clear that an increasing number of people are not going to survive in dignity the harsh conditions and lack of essential services that are coming. It is in this context that human rights, decolonized human rights discourses and practices, are essential. First, to make the violations and injuries visible, and secondly, to name the responsible, and third, to respond and to assess what are the reactions to the debt crisis, how should they look like. The government has a primary responsibility towards the enjoyment of human rights of those living in Puerto Rico. And as I said before, this responsibility extends to the US government, the junta, the creditors, the vultures who own 40 to 50% of Puerto Rico's debt. And budgetary discipline cannot be carried out regardless of human rights. As I said, human rights can help us assess how the US and PR are reacting to the debt crisis and translate our demands into measurable and somehow universal claims against austerity and inequality within indebtedness. The slogan People Before Debt stands for real, effective, and genuine participation, one that includes a public debt audit and the revision of contracts, laws, and policies that promote profit for some and inequality for most, guided by principles of human dignity and self-determination. Participation is not achieved by live streaming, open meetings, or by publishing financial analysis. What people demand is real accountability, naming the responsible and stopping immunity. And this is something that has been carried out by the Hedge Clippers, an organization based in the US that has been investigating vulture funds for a while, and that just published a report naming Carlos Garcia, the man in the picture that John Isabel projected, who is also a member of the control board, as well as other members of the junta, as part of the people who who are responsible for the debt. And that part, accountability, is also very important from a human rights perspective. The primacy of human rights obliged questioning the legitimacy of acts that render people unequal and colonized, those being illegitimate lending contracts, odious debts, the imposition of La Junta, or the exploitation of Puerto Rico. And lastly, I just wanted to say that attending to the crisis cannot be a justification for intervention or aggravated conditions of colonialism, and that the answer may be in the agency of people that for long have been paying attention to the debt crisis, because they have been suffering the impact of the debt crisis for way before that the junta that promesa was passed. So that's it. Thank you.
Now we open the floor for questions from the audience.
Thank you. Those were amazing presentations. Do you want to use the mic?
Yeah, the mic is up here.
If you just repeat the question.
Yeah. Those were terrific presentations. Thank you so much for them. Just two questions. One, this from someone who's not particularly well informed about Puerto Rico. I'm so striking that the kind of colonial kind of situation is so brought into sharp relief by the Promesa program and so on. I just wonder what the impact is on the kind of debates and discussions and plans about the status of Puerto Rico and future possible changes in that status. And then a question mostly, I think, for Joan Isabel is if you could talk a little bit more about what Ariadna was just talking about. Is your newspaper doing research? Is it doing investigating kind of what happened to the funds? If you could tell us a little about, or anyone could tell us a little bit about, how that divvies up. What went to what kinds of wasteful or non-wasteful expenditures, and that would be of great interest. Thank you.
The one with status, I guess.
Yes, I guess. Well, about the effect of Promesa on the status debate, well, that's a very important question. I think it has had a substantial effect. I mean, after the passage of Promesa, I think most people in Puerto Rico from different ideological sectors have become more aware of the tremendous power that Congress exerts over Puerto Rico and the kinds of things that it can do. The fact that it had not done something like that before doesn't mean that it didn't have the power to do it, and it might do even much terrible things in the future. So I think in that sense, Promesa has livened up the status debate. In fact, next June 11th, there will be a referendum in Puerto Rico approved by the current government, in which the question will be submitted to the population in these terms. People will be asked to vote either for statehood or for a sort of a joint alternative called independence or free association, lumped together. So there will be a referendum. Now, whether it probably won't be a binding referendum. So we've had several of those in the past, and nothing has happened. Also, the major opposition party in Puerto Rico, the Popular Democratic Party, is questioning the referendum because the Commonwealth option has not been included in the ballot. So they don't know what to do, and actually that was one of the purposes of this referendum, to sort of throw the popularis off their base. So they are discussing what to do regarding the referendum, whether they will abstain, whether they will participate, but ask their voters to submit blank ballots, whether group of them is arguing for the Estado Libristas to vote for the independence free association option. So there are several, and then there's another position. There's basically about 4 positions. Another position is for the party just to leave their members free to do whatever they want. They're supposed to make a decision on that. So whatever the decision is, that might have an impact on how the referendum results will be interpreted. And also the Congress passed what basically was a rider in a previous legislation, assigning $2.5 million to Puerto Rico to conduct a referendum if Puerto Rico wanted. The condition was that if the money was used, it would be used for education purposes, but then the ballot would have to have the approval of the Attorney General of the U.S. So the Attorney General of the U.S. would have to pass judgment on whether the alternatives on the ballot are constitutional and are consonant to U.S. policy. Those are the two conditions. We don't know what Sessions is going to do with that. And we don't know what effect will that have on the referendum process. But to go back to your initial questions, yes, this has had I think a significant impact on the status debate in Puerto Rico.
Regarding the question about what has happened with this huge amount of debt, I'll go quickly through 3 things. First, Puerto Rico debt is federal, state exempt. So in order to issue debt, Puerto Rico must fulfill with the criteria of the 103 market. And then they could raise capital with institutional or individuals. I say this because most of the debt is what the issue was precisely to build roads, schools, or to build a convention center or a new arena. But the question is if that was necessary or if it was timely and it was the best solution. That's one of the issues. There was another one, and it was that at some point Puerto Rico started issuing debt to finance current expenses. That happened between 2007 and kept going until 2013. When people started asking questions about that, they passed a law. So the lawmakers decided that you could just go ahead, take a 30-year loan to pay for computers and cars and lights at baseball parks. And third, we've reported about different aspects because we think that there are things that deserve more explaining. For example, the way the constitutional margin has been calculated throughout the years, now we see that creditors are precisely, in order to get a piece of the pie, creditors are blaming each other, saying the way that formula was applied was incorrectly. The other party saying, well, they created this new entity that the debt would be paid with the sales tax. That was against the law. I'm not so sure if a court will have the chance to review that. It would be wonderful. But we don't necessarily know if that's the way. It has been that has happened before. It happened in Detroit, but by the time that debt was about to somehow be decided if it was null or not, the parties decided to find a deal, so the judge didn't have to make a decision. We also raised certain stories because in the case of the pension systems, the way to rescue this pension system was allowing the retirement system to issue debt. But when we started digging on the transaction, we found that some of the parties that envisioned the transaction, that designed the transaction, also sell the transaction and also bought the transaction, the bonds, through another entity. But in the case of Puerto Rico, we're not regulated by the SEC. those funds aren't regulated. In fact, about $22 billion of Puerto Rico debt was issued to local holders. And those funds bought that debt. Why? Because those investment companies are not required to comply with federal criteria. If Puerto Rico funds would have been supervised by the SEC, I bet we wouldn't have reached $70 million in debt. But unfortunately, we weren't. So we've been we've been reporting. The Center for Investigative Journalism also has written a couple of pieces trying to dig on who's owning Puerto Rico's debt now. We've been writing, and I hope that it goes further now that maybe that the Public Audit Commission could proceed with their job. That was something that was authorized during the past government, but the current governor decided it was unnecessary until a judge said that the audited of the public debt should proceed.
Thank you very much. A question in the back, yeah?
So thank you for your presentations. Now, you mentioned considering Puerto Rico's situation in an international human rights context. You mentioned the situation as an extension of the legacy of colonialism. Are there other cases in their international human rights sphere where a nation state makes a claim against the colonial powers, and how that might relate to the situation in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, of course. But one of the major obstacles is that, as I was saying before, and maybe to elaborate on what a friend was saying, Puerto Rico is not part of the list of non-governing territories. So the Special Decolonization Committee of the United Nations, which is the committee that attends violations made by national territories, among others, is not able to attend more than our claim, like, to be recognized as a colony. Since 1972, and maybe someone can correct me here with the numbers, we have gone every single year to the Colonization Committee, and the committee has published 35 releases saying basically the same, that the General Assembly has to attend to the issue of Puerto Rico. And the last time, last year, even the current governor went, and they placed the debt crisis in the context of undergoing colonialism. And they also mentioned the lack of available forums, like, to be able to discuss the debt. And every time that the committee approves the resolution, the United States prevents it from being discussing in the General Assembly. Because the argument is that in 1953, when the Commonwealth was established and the Puerto Rico Constitution was passed, the issue was resolved. That's the thing. Another thing is that there are available forums like the the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, but that commission can give recommendations to the U.S., so we cannot put sanctions, and there's no really access to remedies. So that's another obstacle.
Professor Schwartz?
So to extend that question and your answer, the decision that was then made, the two decisions that were then made in the Supreme Court have revealed that, in fact, the colonial situation exists. In the past, from the 1950s on, countries like Cuba, for example, often brought the case of Puerto Rico to the United Nations. So now, with these new decisions from the Supreme Court, it would seem that there might be another opportunity to bring the case again. As an extension of that, what about the situation of the Virgin Islands? How does it differ from Puerto Rico in terms, for example, of its ability to restructure its debt? Is it under the same conditions?
Okay, let me say something about the first part. I think we have to clarify something. In 1953, after the Commonwealth was adopted, the U.S. notified the UN that it would not submit any more reports about Puerto Rico as required by the UN Charter for those countries that had non-autonomous territories under their control. So the U.S. just notified that, and then the UN passed a resolution taking notice and basically agreeing to that. But that happened before 1960, and in 1960 the UN General Assembly adopted what is called as the Magna Carta of Decolonization, which is Resolution 1514, which basically called for all colonial powers to transfer sovereign powers to their colonies, but the phrasing was to all those that still had non-autonomous territories under their jurisdiction, and others who have not yet attained independence. And it is under that provision, others that have not yet attained their independence, that Puerto Rico was able to fall into the jurisdiction of the UN Decolonization Committee. And so the UN Decolonization Committee does have jurisdiction over Puerto Rico. It has assumed jurisdiction over Puerto Rico, and it has adopted all these resolutions that Ariadna was talking about. And they have recommended that the UN General Assembly take up the issue again to review the position that it had adopted in 1953. That hasn't happened yet. But every year, as Ariadna says, more and more groups go to the UN Decolonization Committee to press for UN intervention. Now, that's regarding that issue. So, and regarding the Virgin Islands, Promesa is a law that applies to all the territories. And it says that if the government of a territory asked for a special control board to be established, then it can be established. But under the condition that the territorial government asks for it, solicits the creation of the board. But in the case of Puerto Rico, it just determined, but we are hereby creating the board for Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico, in fact, was treated in a less favorable fashion in that sense than the other 4 U.S. territories, which are expressly mentioned in the Promesa legislation. In the part of the definitions, it says, by territory we mean Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Mariana Islands, and Northern Mariana Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands. So it does apply to the territories, but under that condition. So if the Virgin Islands government wanted, they would have a control board. But if they don't ask for it, then it won't be created.
First of all, thank you to the Macmillan Center for this fantastic. And secondly, my question is to Joan Isabel Gonzalez. Joan Isabel, my question is, do you see a correlation between the 936 Act phased out by the U.S. Congress and all this Puerto Rico scenario?
Yes, but I would say that it's not necessarily as important as many think. I know that I'm aware of Professor Rivera, what he has said. I'm also aware that for many people, Section 936 was a great thing for the economy of Puerto Rico. But the truth is that there's certain literature that points that wasn't the case. The benefits of Section 936 for the economy of Puerto Rico were much less than the benefits that all these pharmaceutical and manufacturing companies got from this preferential treatment. When the Congress decided to end Section 936, it did it because it was under the premise that those manufacturing companies would start paying taxes at the federal level. But it didn't happen. What happened was that those companies evolved and they kept doing business in Puerto Rico, or they've moved overseas. They've moved to Europe, they've moved to Asia, but in Ireland as well. But there is another important thing that, for me, what it's really important with the Section 936, and maybe this is something that not too many people realize, is that Section 936 required these companies to hold part of their monies within the local banking industry. And that money fueled the banking system to a level that we have not expected. Unfortunately, that source of funds would have been served to create a tremendous thriving economy. But it didn't happen. It just helped to create the housing bubble, the commercial bubble, the construction bubble that we went through. But moreover, 936 funds were deposited within the government's development bank. So the government used those monies to allow for a lot of infrastructure projects and a lot of these wishful thinking, wonderful big projects that majors and governors want to have as a legacy. When the Section 936 phased out, those monies vanished. The government decided to cover that loophole with its own debt.
I just want to clarify, when I mentioned 936, I was not arguing that it was a
I
good
know,
thing.
I know.
I was just trying to illustrate
Yes, yes.
the kind of plenary powers that the Congress
course.
has, that it can create 936
Yes.
and then 20 years later eliminate it, and then, and so we're subject to all,
Yes.
those variations.
Agree. Couldn't agree more.
in congressional policy. That's all I wanted to
But
say.
at the very end, that institutional framework,
Can you clarify to us, the non-connoisseurs, the 936? It did create jobs, and it created funds. Was it wise to eliminate it eventually, or were there, I mean, we're not gonna go back now, but to that. But I need to understand if that was a mistake, or if that was the turning point, or if that was or if it is called a turning point, but it isn't. So can someone clarify to me?
But maybe Professor Alameda can address that in the
In a
next
better
panel,
way.
because he's an expert.
Yes.
And we would-
That was pretty smooth.
As a economist, I have many arguments, but few answers.
But maybe one should say that it did have some effect, but not, you can correct me, this general statement I'm going to make, but but it didn't meet the expectations that people, especially the government, placed on that program. Because one thing that I understand that I didn't do, and you correct me, Professor, is that it failed to generate the kind of local linkages that were projected into local enterprises linked to the 936 companies that would then contribute to sort
the
of
state part.
internal
Exactly.
growth and development, and that didn't happen, as I understand it. That didn't happen, and that was one of the problems with the 936 program.
Yes. But at the very end, 936, it's only another version of 901, 956. Now we're talking about 199. And that's the reason I mentioned the thing with the institutional framework and how it's been taken being apart, because you're thinking that by creating these tremendous preferential tax treatments, companies are going to come and they're going to create jobs. And it seems that that's the case. So we'll see. I guess that Professor Alameda would be mastering that subject.
One of the things is that you need a substitution. We never had a substitution first. We never had an alternative to 936. Maybe you have benefit from 936 section, maybe you have cost. This is right. All of this discussion is right. But we never built up a substitution, a framework that substitutes that framework. And this is the wrong way.
Yes.
And we didn't pay attention to trade agreements and how those trade agreements transformed the way companies operate and the way countries do business. So this, besides 936, we were totally clueless about NAFTA. We're still wondering what will happen if Cuba decides to start new businesses and to become a powerful economy within the region. We're not necessarily into that stage, unfortunately.
So, yes?
Yeah, my question is about, first of all, thank you to everyone. My question is more about the political climate Right? We're all aware of the divisive or extremely divisive political climate in Puerto Rico, maybe even more so than the U.S. And to me, based on that, the results of the 2016 election were puzzling in the sense that I didn't see the backlash that I thought I would see against the traditional political players, even though there were new people on the scene who got up to 10%, which is probably more than any third-party candidate or alternative.
She was pretty.
Excuse me?
She's pretty.
Yeah, but even then, it would have been amazing if that 10% had come to someone with an anti-corporate discourse rather than a corporate sounding, which sounds familiar in the U.S. also, right, in terms of how that outsider comes in. But I was wondering if it was just too early for that backlash to come in 2016, too close to the implementation of La Junta, and if we can see that in the next elections, and if it's going to move away from traditional PNP Popular, or if we're stuck with that for a while.
But
And also, one moment, could we have also, there was also another member of the audience that had a question. Could we have also the question so we can, sure, there's no question.
I'm not I'm not famous among my closest friends for being short-winded, so I'll try very hard to limit myself to 2 minutes.
That's all right.
I'd like to word my question the same way most people do who ask questions. They tell you what their answer is. And so I will address this to Ms. Gonzalez because she gave the broadest overview, and I have to ask one of the three of you for the answer. The only right I have to talk at all is I have 2 Puerto Rican grandchildren who are 17 and 19, and if everybody is as smart as those kids, I hope they grow up fast, because I know they have the answer to everything. I wonder how any of us can presume to answer anything when the state of Connecticut is in such deplorable shape. And it's hard for me to respond to because I am so old and I'm falling apart. At the same time, the whole world is falling apart. And nobody has an answer. And the whole world is so much in debt. We really need a new economic system. Another 45 seconds. Okay. That's all. I don't know how we expect, and I don't know how Puerto Rico, I have only had one Yale classmate, Carlos Romero, and I forget what. Barcelo.
Well, no.
I like him, and I talk with him now and then, and I don't know what his reputation is with all of you.
Okay.
Oh, I better go fast.
Keep going.
You could finish for me. But I've been to Puerto Rico only twice, and I had a wonderful time, and everybody was so thoughtful to me. But I think the politicians are not the ones to do the work that the economists really need to do. And I think it's so important to find somebody who can advise and be made a kind of a cabinet to the government, because more and more the government, and all of you may be governors of Puerto Rico, and I apologize for my stupidity, but I don't think the politicians are going to solve this, because they cannot deliver bad news the way it can in your own home when you're going broke and you know you have to do something. You have to stop spending money and you have to find a way. So I would think that in Puerto Rico, an economist board has to be made responsible. I think there has to be somebody who can be accountable, who can invest in the equivalent of investing in Connecticut and invest in Puerto Rico. And when there are results, make it for profit and motivate people that way.
Could we let them then answer the question?
Oh, the question, I forgot I had.
I thought there was a question.
It's realistic, maybe, to to reevaluate what the wonderful things are of Puerto Rico, and the whole world is trying to do this. And like tourism, and I'm sure you've worked on that, but I've seen no place except for 5 days a year when the hurricanes come through. And I wonder if you can't do a lot more with tourism and drive and make somebody more accountable. Sorry, I apologize.
No, it's okay.
It's all right.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, I'm sorry.
No, thank you.
I know that Professor Alameda is gonna talk about the possibilities of Puerto Rico, and I know that tourism sector certainly could be a more important player within the entire economy. I do have to say that there's been throughout time, there's been a lot of different efforts. There's been certain initiatives from one governor and other governors creating economic councils, creating task force to identify how to reignite the economy. But we are unable to make those processes our own and provide continuity to those initiatives. For some reason that I don't understand, and maybe this is the striking thing about all this reporting, is that we've been writing not only for politicians, but also for people, for entrepreneurs, from the people within the NGO sector. And you would think that once you see all those potential outcomes, that they would say, we're here, we want to be part of the solution. But for some reason, everything relies on politics. Entrepreneurs decide that they have this wonderful initiative, but they need the support of the government. You would go to the academy, to the universities, and it will happen the same. And until we don't realize, until we don't accept that the entire society must convey for a path, for a mission, for a development identity. I don't know if this is right, but the people, I mean, India knows what their society, what kind of role the society wants to play. California knows they're the innovation center of the United States. China made sure that he was the powerhouse of the world. What Puerto Rico would be, what role Puerto Rico would like to have within the U.S. economy, within the world economy, that's a question that remains an answer. And unfortunately, so far, I think that not too many people are willing to analyze it and trace a course to achieve that goal.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I want to answer quickly. We had, for the first time, I think, we had two successful independent candidates on the last election, but both of them had a very corporate-oriented campaign, and their positions regarding the debt were not really clear, and they were really cautious, to take a very strict position about or repayment the debt or having the public audit, naming the debt illegitimate. What I think happened in the last election is that the government that won, it's always one of the same two parties for the last 60 years, but the government that won, it is a very conservative government. It's a very religious-based government. One of the first action of the governor was to abolish gender perspective from the, I don't know what that means, but abolish gender perspective from the public education system. And that's only one of the ways in which he tries to express the nature of the government. And in the context of a debt crisis, that's going to show in public policies that keep criminalizing poverty and having no idea of what's really happening with the most precarious people in the island. For the next election, I think that two things are going to be very influential. First is the disillusionment with the status of the island. The pro-Commonwealth Party is having an internal crisis because they are realizing that the Commonwealth is alive. And at the same time, the pro-statehood supporters are still going through the I can't believe this is happening stage of having an unelected federally imposed government. and realizing that we are going to be left out of the health reform, and realizing that there's not going to be any kind of federal support to Puerto Rico, not under Obama, nor under the Trump administration. And that has been like very shocking for the party of Carlos Romero Barceló. And later we're going to have coffee and we can talk about Carlos Romero Barceló in detail. And also the public audit. One of the big things about hedge clippers, that's what I mentioned Carlos Garcia, because some of the protests are moving to the office of these people that's connected to the debt crisis. And the role of starting to unveil those responsible for taking illegitimate debt has been very important, and the resistance maybe can be explained in the fact that many of these people belong to both of the main parties and have been for long getting richer by the crisis. So I think that explains the resistance to the public audit, and also what could happen in the next elections after the public audit, if it is ever completed. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to add briefly that I think it's necessary to analyze how the different actors in Puerto Rico place themselves in this sort of drama, and try to understand the positions of the different political parties and personalities that are involved. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the structural dimensions of the problem. There are structural dimensions to the problem that transcend the political parties here and the political parties in the US. That's why you see the Obama administration and the Trump administration basically adopting similar positions regarding Puerto Rico. And it's not because Obama is such and such and Trump is such and such, it's because of the structural relationship between the US and Puerto Rico. And that is also true within Puerto Rico. So, and one aspect of the structural problems is precisely their relationship that I try to sort of describe in my presentation. And that has to be addressed. If that is not addressed, then I think we won't be addressing the real problems. I am not saying that the status problem is the only problem. There are structural economic dimensions also, and political also, structural political dimensions in terms of how we have organized ourselves politically internally. And there are many vices and many deficiencies in our political culture that have to be addressed. So you have to take into account all of that. So it's not just who is president now or who is governor now, because we have been having these problems for decades. In fact, for over 100 years, we've had similar problems. So, and I think that's where some of the the hard thinking has to be done, and the hard acting has to be done. And in terms of the political relationship, but I think that the colonial relationship as it is unworkable. I mean, it's no matter who wins the next elections, it's unworkable. And the other thing that we have to take into account is to try to distinguish. I always try to do that between the structural relationship, the basic structural relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and the particular arrangement through which that relationship expresses itself. The so-called Commonwealth is just the way that the colonial relationship was organized after 1952. But we might lapse into another colonial articulation with a different name. And so that's not the problem. The problem is the relationship itself, and the deep structural connections, which includes, by structure I also mean, I like this notion of structure as accumulated practice. The types of political and economic practices and attitudes we have developed over the decades that explain why we are here now, and that might be the key to understanding how we can get out. I'm sorry, get out of these crises, because it's not just one crisis, all of these crises.
Well, please join me in applauding our presenters. Thank you very, very much for your participation, and we do hope that you join us in our second session.
We have coffee and refreshments. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the second roundtable of our event, Puerto Rico, an island under siege, Puerto Rico's current financial, political, and human rights crisis. So this is going to be the second roundtable, at which perhaps many of the questions that were raised in the first one may well be answered. But we don't know.
Maybe not.
We shall see. I'm Professor Aníbal González Pérez from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. So those of you who are not from Yale, I'd like to welcome you to our university and to the law school. And just to add as a parenthetical comment, just a mere impression, since I'm in the presence of Professor Stuart Schwartz, who has written a wonderful book about hurricanes in the Caribbean and its social history, it occurs to me that one possible way to, or the many ways to face this crisis is to think of it as a kind of slow-moving hurricane. And because one of the issues that is also floating around in the room is the whole issue of getting people together to actually collaborate on some sort of solution to a problem that affects everybody. And so certainly a hurricane would seem to focus your mind a lot in that regard, and perhaps thinking about the crisis in that way might help. So certainly it's an open political question. No? So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this afternoon. Our first speaker is going to be Jorge Rodriguez Berruf, and he is director of the interdisciplinary degree program at the Universidad Carlos Albizu. He's also the former dean of General Studies, the General Studies faculty in the University of Puerto Rico. And he's also the founding president of the Puerto Rican Association of International Relations. Our second speaker is going to be Danelle Gutarra. Danelle holds a PhD in history from the University of Puerto Rico. She is currently teaching in the writing program at Princeton University, and as I think we heard before, she will be a visiting fellow at Harvard University after the summer, right? Or
During the summer.
During the summer. And last but not least, we'll be hearing from Jose Israel Alameda Lozada, who Professor Alameda is a professor of economics in the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez campus. He has served as a consultant in economics and planning for the government of Puerto Rico. His research deals with areas such as fiscal and economic issues, international trade, environmental studies, and energy and health economics. In 2016, he served as a member of the committee to audit Puerto Rico's debt. So we will begin our panel with Professor Rodriguez Berruf's intervention.
I wish to thank Yale University for this invitation and for sponsoring this important panel on the situation in Puerto Rico. My comments will try to place the present situation in Puerto Rico in a broad historical perspective, because with what we are dealing with in Puerto Rico now is not a business cycle crisis. It is, I would call it, without exaggerating, an epochal change. A change in the way the state is organized, in the way in which Puerto Rico relates to the United States. So it's akin to the changes that took place in the 1930s and in the 1940s. And I think we should approach the situation in Puerto Rico not as a fiscal crisis, but as a very deep institutional transformation. And I have called my paper Promesa and Alice's Predicament. And when I quote from Alice in Wonderland, you will understand why I put that title on my paper. I quote, Alice, would you tell me please which way I ought to go from here? The Cheshire Cat, that depends a good deal on where you want to go. Alice, I don't much care where. The Cheshire Cat, then it doesn't much matter which way you go. Alice, so long as I get somewhere. The Cheshire Cat, oh, you're sure to do that, if you only walk long enough. I think that we are in Alice's situation, that we are walking to some place we don't know where. So I would begin by saying that when you read the fiscal plan of February 26th of this year, in the executive summary, it says, Puerto Rico's fiscal and economic challenges are the result of an extended period of fiscal irresponsibility, ineffective leadership, lack of long-term economic planning, and frequent changes. And adds that Puerto Rico's current crisis is the result of a failed economic and political model. And there are other explanations that have been given to the crisis that place emphasis on the dominance of a corrupt and self-serving political class and its use of the spoils system to remain in power. Also, others have blamed the bipartisan system that developed after 1968 as the cause for the present economic malaise. And I don't want to dispute those explanations. They are the easy explanations, the obvious explanations. I would say that to understand what is happening, one has to go beyond that, because I don't think the political class in Puerto Rico is now more corrupt than before, or that the political class in Puerto Rico is more corrupt than the political class in other countries. Just look at Brazil, for example. So my thesis in this paper is that what is happening now is the end of an era for Puerto Rico's internal institutional arrangements and also in post-war U.S.-Puerto Rico relations. And it cannot be solely explained in terms of the shortcomings of its political elite. Its understanding requires to place it in a broad historical context. It is always difficult to define historical periods, but I would say that what is coming to an end now is this institutional arrangement, the social, economic, political arrangement that began developing in the 1930s and 1940s and consolidated in the 1950s and then entered into crisis. I think the crisis really begins in 1973, precisely when 936 came into, we were talking about that. In the 1930s, the response of the U.S. to the crisis in Puerto Rico was to try to stimulate the economy through a large bureaucracy and federal funds. The bureaucracy was called PRERA and then PRA. And this bureaucracy became 5 times bigger than the government of Puerto Rico. It generated 58,000 jobs. So the logic of the New Deal in Puerto Rico was a Keynesian logic to try to stimulate the economy through a bigger government and through government expenditures. Then the Second World War also promoted important changes in Puerto Rico. The war meant that a lot of money flowed into Puerto Rico for defense preparations. And also ROM revenues came into the economy, and the salaries of the soldiers, there were over 50,000 Puerto Ricans recruited in the Second World War. The salaries also went into the economy. And while this was happening in the economy, we had in Puerto Rico Rexford Tocqueville as governor. And he was an institutionalist economist who thought that the state had to be a counterbalance to private interests. And Tocqueville's governorship coincided with the reforms pushed by the Popular Party in Puerto Rico. So by the end of the war, there was a new type of state in Puerto Rico with a new type of economy. Puerto Rico was no longer a sugar island. It was a modernized economy relying on industrial investment, mainly foreign investment. The first phase of this economic growth was light manufacturing capital, and that phase began to falter, and that's when 936 came in to breathe new life into that arrangement. So I would summarize what I've been saying by the following. The interplay of the war context, the emergence of a reformist political force that had asserted its unquestioned dominance by 1944, and the governorship of Rexford G. Tocqueville created the conditions of the institutional arrangements embodied in the Estado Libre Asociado of the 1950s, and the pattern of rapid economic growth since the late 1940s and the early 1970s. And I would say that that arrangement also meant a certain type of relationship with the United States. That although formally, as it has been argued, Congress had plenary powers, it did not exercise its powers then as it is doing it now. That relationship was based on strategic interests. During the Second World War, Puerto Rico was a major military enclave for the United States. And when the Cold War came into being very rapidly after the Second World War, Puerto Rico was still strategically important from the United States. And it was strategically important, and that began to change in the 1970s. But when the crisis of 1973 came about, Puerto Rico was still considered very important strategically to the United States in the context of the Cold War. So Congress had a stake in not permitting the destabilization of the Puerto Rican economy or social unrest to manifest itself and destabilize the political arrangement. I think you understand more or less where I'm trying to get. By the mid-60s, there was an economist, perhaps later you can explain that. His name was Genaro Vaquero, and he was also a functionary of the Puerto Rican government. And he pointed out in 1964 that the Puerto Rican economic model had basic flaws that were showing themselves. The basic flaws was, one, that it relied too much on foreign capital, and there was no sufficient role for the Puerto Rican capital. And two, that the public indebtedness was rising very rapidly. So since the 1960s, that was pointed out. Still, in 1966, the Status Commission was very optimistic about the future of the economy of Puerto Rico. The economic report of the Status Commission said that unless a status change would destabilize the growth model of Puerto Rico, the economy would continue to flourish. It is ironic that it has not been status change that has destabilized the economy, but world processes that manifest themselves in the situation of Puerto Rico. So in the 1970s, if you recall what happened in 1970s, it was a very profound crisis of the world economy and of the US economy. The background was the Vietnam War and the overcommitment internationally of the United States. The first thing that happened was that Nixon decided to abandon the Bretton Woods agreement, the monetary agreement of the Second World War. And then in 1973, the US economy that was growing at 7% rate dropped to 2%, minus 2%. And then came the oil crisis in 1973. As you know, Nixon supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, and then the Arab states established the oil embargo. Oil went from $3 to $12. And what happened to the US economy was felt in Puerto Rico like an earthquake to the economy. I'll just give you very briefly some of the impacts that were felt in Puerto Rico. $1.3 billion in value of the production was lost in Puerto Rico. 58,000 people lost their jobs. Of these jobs, that's 1973 and 1974, of these jobs, 38,000 jobs were lost in construction alone. There were, unemployment rose to 20%. There were 270 strikes. And the UPR students went on strike for 3 months. So we have a very similar situation now. But what happened then? How did Puerto Rico get out of the crisis? One, the Rafael Hernández Colón government started taking debt to increase the number of government jobs, and government employment increased by 37,000. That was one anti-crisis measure. The other measures that happened had to do with Congress and the US government. Food stamps were approved. In 1971 they were approved, and they were implemented in 1974. And very rapidly, money for food stamps rose to $500 million. But not only food stamps, also federal funds began to rise very rapidly. The other measure that Congress took was the 936 subsidy to industry. So what Congress did, and the executive of the US government did in that juncture, was to try to stimulate the Puerto Rican economy for it to overpass this crisis. But what has happened now is in deep contrast to what has happened in 1973, now 1974. What has changed? I think that what has changed is the strategic relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. In the 1970s, still the US had a lot of military bases in Puerto Rico. It had Roosevelt Roads, it had Vieques, it had Ramey Air Force Base, and now it has none. But not only these bases were closed by the willingness of the US to close them, but in the case of Vieques, the Puerto Rican people pressed to have the Navy out of Vieques. And The Navy, at least our friend Juan Manuel Garcia Pasalacqua, if he had been here, he would have said there's an invisible government in the US and that the Navy was a very important actor in that invisible government. And now the Navy has no stake in Puerto Rico at all. And I would say there are very little residual military activities in Puerto Rico. Other people will be speaking about the crisis, so I would only make some final questions. One is, what are the residual interests of the United States in Puerto Rico after the waning of a long-standing strategic relationship? Is there a real commitment with the welfare of US citizens in Puerto Rico? Is there concern that with the consequences to the international image of the US of the economic collapse of its Caribbean territory? Or does the United States doesn't mind at all seeing what is happening in Puerto Rico, if perhaps they think that it has no cost? Does the argument regarding respect for the civil rights of Puerto Ricans made by some political sectors have resonance in US political circles? I would question it. Is there concern with massive migration to the US, or is migration being used as a convenient escape valve that prevents confronting the problems of a decaying economy? I previously thought that there was a concern in the US with migration. Now I doubt it. I think Puerto Rican migration, if Puerto Rico had had 40 million inhabitants, perhaps there was concern with migration. But the population of Puerto Rico is 3.5 million, and Puerto Rican migration is like a drop in the ocean in such a huge economy as the US. And finally, has Puerto Rico fallen through the cracks of the US political system? Like Alice, Puerto Rico will get somewhere if it walks long enough. The question is that we do not know where. Thank you.
I would like to take a moment to, even though I've already done so at the beginning with my moderation, to express my profound gratitude to Professor Maria Jordan, to Professor Stuart Schwartz, to CLICE, and to Yale Law School. Thank you so much for this opportunity. In 1963, C.L.R. James published the second edition of his seminal text, The Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture and the San Domingo Revolution. The most notable edition of the second edition is an epilogue on the Caribbean that only dedicates one paragraph to Puerto Rico. This brief mention argues that Puerto Rico has the, I quote, near celestial privilege of free entry into the United States. The Pan-Africanist author also states that, I quote, American money for investment and American loans and gifts should create the Caribbean paradise, but concludes, I quote, Puerto Rico is just another West Indian island. This rationale is all too familiar. It has been insistently replicated as a succinct afterthought of the case of Puerto Rico. Indeed, the tourism industry in the Caribbean has consistently evoked idyllic imagery of a tropical paradise with piña coladas to spare and to be enjoyed with the US dollar. In the trivialized packaging of the Puerto Rican experience, the answer to why Puerto Rico has not been able to transform almost heavenly circumstances into paradise lies in the Puerto Rican people. This reasoning contends that there must be an inherent flaw of the people that impedes its political and economic evolution into something that closer resembles the bliss of privilege. This rhetoric is fueled by the ambiguity and the ambivalence that have nurtured a veil of legitimacy, a veil that aims to conceal from public discourse the racialist foundations of the current political and economic relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. In the book, Empire in World History, Power and the Politics of Difference, Jane Burbank and Frederick Cooper argue that, I quote, "The concept of empire presumes that different peoples within the polity will be governed differently. According to the volume, empires are sustained by the intrinsic element of their politics of difference. Politics of difference are imposed through a premeditated racialization of colonial hierarchies. Empires of the 19th and 20th centuries indeed benefited from racialized differences, since they justified policies in terms of wealth distribution and military recruitment. Politics of difference were fundamental not only for colonial exploitation, but for the international projection of the progression of the empire and its power." The authors point to the United States as a peculiar example of imperialism, since even though its political history was distinguished by a rapid and bellicose acquisition of territories, the nation avoided the appreciation of being an imperial power with colonies. Nonetheless, the United States had indeed extended their power overseas at the end of the 19th century and intervened in the Caribbean during the 20th century. Before the invasion of Puerto Rico as part of the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States had already nurtured economic dependency in the Spanish colony. The Treaty of Paris then ceded the Spanish province to the clause of manifest destiny, and a short-lived military government was inflicted until the 1900 Foraker Act granted a civilian government with its governor being selected by the President of the United States, initiating a lengthy history of political ambiguity of Puerto Rico as an incorporated territory. The insular cases analyze the implications of the recently concocted doctrine of incorporation to denote the special relationship between the United States and its territory, a relationship that could culminate at any moment by the prerogative of metropolitan whim, in which Congress would have the last word, and in which the Supreme Court would assess the limited application of the Constitution through the ambiguous/ambivalent concept of fundamental rights. The insular cases are still the jurisprudence that sustains the colonial condition of Puerto Rico and are grounded on racialist discourses and Plessy versus Ferguson rhetoric. Justice Henry Billings Brown supported the argument for non-incorporation of Puerto Rico by infamously affirming the following in the Downs versus Bidwell case. "It is obvious that the annexation of outlying and distant possessions, grave questions will arise from differences of race, habits, laws, and customs of the people, and from differences of soil, climate, and production, which may require action on the part of Congress that would be quite unnecessary in the annexation of contiguous territory inhabited only by the people of the same race or by scattered bodies of native Indians." The idiom "foreign in a domestic sense" then encompasses the discursive ambivalence that validates the construction of inadequacy of Puerto Ricans for self-government, and in turn disguises the role of racialism in imperial intervention. Precisely due to ideas of incompetence, during the early 20th century, politics of cultural assimilation were prescribed by colonial authorities, like the imposition of English as the language of public education, indoctrination of American heroes and tales, and the ban of Puerto Rican nationalist symbols. The project of the Americanization of the Puerto Rican population was constructed as benevolent imperialism, but fortunately, its experiments failed miserably, as the colonial population persisted in the defense of the Spanish language and the Puerto Rican hybrid customs as unalterable components of national identity. In 1917, the Jones Act was enforced, providing the Puerto Rican population with United States citizenship. The most tangible repercussion of the Jones Act would be the immediate eligibility for obligatory military service in World War I. Tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans fought during World War I despite the lack of voting representation in the political arena of the United States. This statutory birthright citizenship further unraveled the deconstruction of the foreignness and non-foreignness of Puerto Rico in the jurisprudence by clarifying that the statutory nature of this U.S. citizenship was tied to the non-domestic nature of the locality of birth. On the contrary, the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 would hang on to the domestic nature of Puerto Rico by restraining its economic growth by subjugating it to the interests of the U.S. domestic shipping industry. Thus, due to obscure fine print, Puerto Ricans were internationally pressured to feel privileged about their second-class citizenship and disadvantaged economic structure. Not surprisingly, the first 4 decades of the 20th century represented a time of economic hardship and hunger in Puerto Rico. The financial limitations of Puerto Rico due to the cabotage law, the premeditated deterioration of the coffee industry, the elevated levels of anemia, the impact of 2 destructive hurricanes, and most importantly, the prioritization of the interests of U.S. corporations incited the severe effects of the Great Depression in the island. Nevertheless, during most of the 20th century, the metropolitan and colonial governments would repeatedly concede blame to overpopulation in Puerto Rico. In The Location of Culture, Homi Bhabha argues that power dynamics in colonialism revolve around the concept of mimicry. This mimesis could be described as an intentional cultural assimilation that simultaneously perpetuates an inescapable difference. In the case of Puerto Ricans, one of the marks of inadequacy would be the signifier of poverty, as an emblematic trait not of colonial exploitation, but of cultural inferiority. Furthermore, Puerto Rican residents and members of the diaspora were projected as a dependent community, fusing the stigma of poverty with a reputation for welfare dependency. United States citizenship then represents, instead of a birthright, a burden, a crucial foundation of the racialization of Puerto Ricans. Definitions of race and ethnicity in the United States have been distinguished by hyphenated identities. Hyphenation embodies the linguistic indicator of politics of difference, establishing a simplistic hierarchy of Americanness. Due in part to the unintelligible political tensions with the United States, the Puerto Rican diaspora has not been attributed nor has it claimed a hyphenated identity. Nevertheless, the colonial politics of difference and their implications with the convenient racialization of Puerto Ricans were manifest and discernible during the debates that led to the concretization of the Foraker Act, the Insular Cases, the Jones Act, and the long-lived tensions surrounding colonial relations. Furthermore, 20th century journalism and mass media in the United States ascribed to an aggressive agenda to racialize poverty and its arbitrary collateral signifiers, portraying African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and other minorities as inclined toward criminal activity, drug addiction, low academic performance, and sexual precociousness. The racialization of Puerto Ricans evolved as one in which color did not occupy a dominant position, since the racial category had to fit the diversity of this mixed community, according to arbitrary 18th and 19th century pseudoscientific theories that generated the modern constructions of race. The diversity of color did not represent an obstacle to establish phenotypical traits with which to recognize a distinct racialized other. Particularly the celebration of Puerto Rican culture, the employment of Spanish, the usage of 2 last names, and most importantly, the accent that is connoted in the racial slur that is used against Puerto Ricans. These attributes were conceived as signifiers of indolence, ignorance, and intrinsic violence, making it impossible for the United States consciousness to envisage Puerto Ricans as authentic American citizens. Still, the racialist currents of geographical and biological determinism induced the particular racialization of Puerto Ricans. Geographical determinism due an inexorable connection between climates and progress, as evidenced in the Downs versus Whitwell decision, typically depicting human groups of hotter climates as lethargic and in consequence retrograde. Meanwhile, pseudoscientific theories of biological determinism conceived miscegenation as a degenerative phenomenon. These racialist theories justified colonial subordination of frozen-in-time territories, however abstruse the degree of interventionism could be. The role of ambiguity in racially premised interventionism and its repercussions in legitimacy and thus inaction led to disconcerting narratives of hunger, marginalization of children, segregated military service, and human experimentation on Puerto Rican bodies that included interaction with mustard gas, cancer cells, radiation, and hormones. The justifications of both interventionism and non-incorporation centered on the racialized Puerto Rican body as a dispositive of imperial concealment. The bodily functions of the Puerto Rican were to be observed, studied, supervised. In 1948, Puerto Rican landscapes were radically altered because of the modernizing policies of Operation Bootstrap, which originated the transformation of the territory into an island of cement by conceding investment incentives to United States corporations. The facade of economic growth aimed to hide again and again the question of the agency of the colonized. Operation Bootstrap was yet another confirmation that economic development would not be produced or conceptualized by the Puerto Rican people, but instead US corporations would become even more dominant. As 20th century colonial relations highlighted discourses on the modernization, the education, the cultural assimilation of Puerto Ricans, dissent and denunciations against the vague minimization of colonialism would be silenced with brutal force. It is in this juncture that the Law 600 and the establishment of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico would serve as subterfuge to remove Puerto Rico from the list of colonies of the United Nations when self-determination had not materialized. The imprecise concept of the Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico and the approval by Congress of a constitution with questionable relevance did nothing but hide under the rug the fact that this gesture has much more to do with internal government than self-government, and everything to do with the projection of the United States as a non-empire in international conversations about decolonization. Still, the rest of the 20th century, the United States government turned a blind eye to myths of Puerto Rican privilege and dependency, even when the majority of Puerto Ricans have consistently lived under the poverty level. Even when public trivializations of the fiscal responsibility of Puerto Rico and lack of federal income tax have ignored the reality of second-class treatment of Puerto Rico in US federal funding. Even when the economic relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico has always primarily benefited US revenue and constrained the economic development in the island. And even when Puerto Rico has never had a political voice or representation in the land of the free and the home of the brave. The current political and economic scenario not only corroborates that racially fueled ambiguous legislation continues to be the law of the land, in which the people of Puerto Rico have incomprehensible standing. The discourse of colonial privilege / dependency is entirely too convenient. Therefore, it is vital to analyze our present-day juncture to find evidence of near-celestial privilege, as the 20th century has not provided us with heavenly material. Alas, a three-headed monster has been generated renewed uncertainty in Puerto Rico, a monster that reminds us of the Jíbaro eating sugar factory in Bagazo by Abelardo Díaz Alfaro. Puerto Rico versus Franklin, California Tax-Free Trust represented yet another confusing piece of jurisprudence that claims that Puerto Rico is a state for purpose of limitations of bankruptcy law, and it's not a state for purposes of the protections provided by bankruptcy law. The Sanchez-Valle decision defeated the fiction of self-government and self-determination by upholding that Congress and not the people of Puerto Rico had been the ultimate source of authority in the approval of the Constitution of the Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico. The last and most frightening head of the monster is the Oversight Board, approved as an act distastefully labeled by its initials as Promesa. The Oversight Board has been granted with plenary powers over the democratically selected government, has the authority to disallow the governor and the public from participating in sessions, and hold the prerogative to review any proposed legislation for consistency with the budget and fiscal plan. Following the path of the unintelligible, Promesa affirms that, I quote, "Nothing in this act shall be interpreted to restrict Puerto Rico's right to determine its future political status," and provides the Oversight Board with the supremacy to approve a minimum wage less than the federal minimum wage for workers under the age of 25. Furthermore, Promesa requires the government of Puerto Rico to, I quote, "designate a dedicated funding source for the operations of the Oversight Board, while the Oversight Board establishes the salary of the Executive Director." Controversially, the recently selected Executive Director of the Oversight Board will be receiving an annual salary of $625,000, adding to the millions of dollars that have already been spent on highly publicized meetings. Hence, in addition to $1 billion debt, the fiscal responsibility of the middle class of Puerto Rico has been augmented by the push to austerity, by the expenses of the Oversight Board, and by the recent imposition of a labor reform by the conservative neoliberal governor that has reduced both the income and employment benefits of the already burdened middle class of Puerto Rico. The Oversight Board then decided to attack one of the most beloved institutions in Puerto Rico, La Universidad de Puerto Rico, by intending to cut its budget by $450 million. The University of Puerto Rico does not only stand as the oldest institution of higher education in Puerto Rico, but it also has been the embodiment of Puerto Rican intellectual production, cohesion, and opposition. The ulterior motives of Promesa are then evident. This is not a conversation about dollars. This is an assault on one of the increasingly scarce spaces where Puerto Rican agency is possible. However, the representation of the Oversight Board in US media is apologetic and even hopeful for the future of Puerto Rico under fiscal supervision. The rationales behind the tolerant view of Promesa are the evidence that oversight boards have been successful in some states of the Union, and the argument that the overwhelming debt of Puerto Rico is due to inefficient local governance during the last decades. This reasoning is also all too familiar. But amid a narrative of ambiguity and ambivalence, a few steps back can also engender a sense of certainty. There are unequivocal responses to this reasoning by using the vague language of our colonial history. Puerto Rico is not sovereign, even though it is foreign. Puerto Rico is not a state, even though it can be spoken of in a domestic sense. Therefore, it could not matter less if an oversight board has worked in a space in which its population has political representation and equal footing in the law. The argument of incompetent governance is entirely objectionable in the context of the colonial history of Puerto Rico, because it perpetuates the racialist discourses that insist that Puerto Ricans do not have the capacity for self-government, are not worthy of political representation, and thus flaunt the privilege to be supervised and under perennial colonial subordination. Promesa epitomizes a significant blow to Puerto Rican agency that cannot and will no longer be dismissed by neither ambiguity nor ambivalence. Therefore, the imposition of an oversight board should not be scrutinized in isolated conversations about politics or economics. This is instead an overall, a difficult conversation about a painful narrative of violations of human rights. Even though it seems that the monster is winning, the veil that legitimizes racially premised interventionism is being ripped to shreds. Perhaps the near celestial refers to this purgatory in which we, the people of Puerto Rico, are fighting for the right to breathe and to be let alone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll be the last on the meeting. So glad to Mr. Juarez, glad to Maria. I'm very glad to be here representing Puerto Rico and the class of economists. I teach economics in the University of Puerto Rico. Sometimes I found a former student from my classes, I remember I used to go with a lot of water, stand up, and a glass of coffee. There is a way that we do the classes. And this is the way that I'm going to present my presentation. Basically, I will try to emphasize in economic growth, because I think that instead of have PROMESA, or instead of have fiscal board, we should make a plan first of economic growth, increase the capacity of Puerto Rico to pay, and then to make all the adjustment to the bondholders and so on. But this is the way we are going to address my issue today. I want to also recognize that Mr. Alfredo Gonzalez is a co-author, is a retired professor of the economics department in Puerto Rico. We have been dealt with that area from a while. Let's start with the main lemma. Lemma is a principle. Without economic growth, any level of debt services will be unsustainable. And Puerto Rico will continue to endure fiscal and economic crisis. That's the way, no other way. Forget about the bad guy of the movie, PROMESA, fiscal board, and the 7 jinetes del apocalipsis. I'm going to say in Spanish to be clear. We never solved the problem. From my point of view, and the first forecast in this economic law forecast, usually they don't make anyone. But there is no way to solve the problem of Puerto Rico using the way that they are dealing with. PROMESA, everybody knows, we are talking about, they have basically, it's a law, and they have 3 main objectives: establish a fiscal oversight board, provide the process of restructuring the debt, and make some procedures on critical infrastructure projects. This is the structure of PROMESA. You have 7 titles. Title 1 and 2 is, or the organization deals with the organization of fiscal board in Puerto Rico. Title 3 and 6, they are very important, deals with the debts and credit and all the litigation problems. And Puerto Rico, and Title 3 will be on the federal court. And Title 5 is a general concern about some issues of the economy. Title 4 is the issue of rehabilitating our infrastructure. And the last one, 7, is only a final word. It's a jingle bell, something like that. They say nothing. It's a very narrow area. So from my point of view right now, we have a big trouble in Puerto Rico. A lot of fight. The first fight, bondholders against bondholders. Those general obligation bondholders are fighting with the Puerto Rico Sales Tax Financial Corporation bondholder. Each one say, you are illegal. No, you are the one. No, you are illegal. No, you are the one. So they are no way to address the issue. Hedge funds, they are fighting against Puerto Rico, the debt of Puerto Rico, and also are fighting to the government. Bondholders also are fighting against the fiscal board. And then they are fighting against fiscal board because they certify the fiscal plan from Ricardo Rosselló in 2017. So local legislature, Senate, and the House of Representatives, they are fighting against the fiscal board. So instead of solve the problem, we have new problems right now. We are increasing. We have a new dimension of the real problem. So there is no other ways that go bankruptcy. Title 3 is waiting for us, and maybe Bezosa, a federal judge, is waiting for us to split the bacalao. To split the catfish, you say. Fiscal board, this is the way that I teach the classes. There is no other way. The fiscal board, I heard, I saw that Joan Isabel presented very similar numbers, but according to them, you have to close the fiscal gap. Here's the problem. Rising revenue, more taxes, property taxes. We had taxes already, but we have more taxes right now. Even though in the campaign, the claim of the other party said, hey, you put a lot of taxes. But now, forget it. The taxes are the same one, plus we have another ones. So basically, we have new taxes, or new way to enhance revenues. And according to the, let me see, the board, we need 1.5 billion. That means 15% more on revenue enhancements. Meanwhile, in government rising, we have to get down the government by 1.5, which is 24 down of the current level. Reducing healthcare spending is on 1 billion. This is because Medicaid funds will maybe not be able, because Congress will never sign the bill to bring back 1.2 billion of revenue. Anyway, we have to look 1 billion to support the health government program. Otherwise, we have no money. Reducing high expenditure, high education spending, University of Puerto Rico, as you said before. And pension reform also, you have a cut. So then you have 0.5 billion of revenues enhancement or savings. Our forecast, we like forecasts. Yes, I am an economist. We put together of this in our econometric models, and we look for a drop more or less of 5%, which is 4 times the current annual decline of 1.3%. Then our main thesis is that Federal Oversight Board had not properly diagnosed the slump of the economy of Puerto Rico, because we are not in a single recession. We are not in a single depression. We are in an even more deep concern paradigm, which some economists call secular stagnation. I will show you what is the meaning of secular stagnation. The board has considered this slump, according to the papers and so on that I read, as a recession phase. As a conventional business cycle, it's a drop in the economic activity. We can fix it together. We are really impacted with the Puerto Rican. I love Puerto Rican, oh my God, and all this stuff. And they are going to solve this problem trying to furnish the short-term liquidity to your fiscal imbalance and by restructuring the debt. But according to myself, according to author, the fiscal board and the expertise members has failed to current diagnosis of the economy. Our economy is literate because our inputs of production is less. We have less human capital, we have less investment, so the capacity of growth is declining, not because you have a current business cycle, it's because you have a potential business cycle. You have a drop in the capacity of growth, and you have to restore first the capacity of growth, create more revenue, create jobs, and then pay the debt, not on the other way around. The same happens to the econometrics model and so on. They look the conventional business cycle. So basically, our main proposition is that the fiscal board prescription will hurt economic growth in the short run and the middle run. Neither it might rectify the structural failures of the local economy. Why? Sorry, I have a sore throat. Because they improper diagnosis the problem of Puerto Rico. And all these measures are really draconics, a huge amount. Its measure raises uncertainty about the impact on the long run. They never know about the migration. They certify a plan in which the population decline was 0.2% when the history of Puerto Rico, population is declining by 1%. So I don't know who did this kind of, the decline in the population is 0.2% all the way down for 10 years. Forget it, it's not true. Because as long as you make all this mess in the economy, you will see more immigration to the United States. So that means that the variable immigration is endogenous rather than exogenous, as we call later. So they have not proper rehabilitate programs because the long run of the capacity of growth. So finally, fiscal board policy will probably retard economic growth, retard economic recovery, and may exacerbate social distress, and we're gonna get more inequality in the economy of Puerto Rico. So our main conclusion here is that from PROMESA and from Federal Oversight Board, the economy will be first worse off rather than better off. The fiscal board will never solve the problem. Okay, because maybe they close the bridge between fiscal gap. They close revenue, of course. They are increasing the taxes. They may decline the expenditure. Of course, they are declining the expenditure. So you close the gap in the painful way to the citizens of Puerto Rico. You close the gap using the way in the proper manner, because you're going to reduce the economic welfare of the Puerto Ricans, of the residents. The way to restore the economics, to close the gap, is to impose a sustainable economic growth that will increase revenue. And of course, watch the politicians in Puerto Rico will be using the revenue. And also to decline the expenditure in a good and a manner in order to decline the expenditure, but increasing the economic growth. In order to close the gap, not using more taxes, decreasing revenue, but encouraging economic growth. And this is why I do believe. The economy of Puerto Rico right now is in secular stagnation. What is the meaning of that? This, as I said before, this is not a period in a current recession. This is not a period in the current depression. We have, let me show you some graph here. In a conventional cycle, you had two frames. Economic activity, you see here. This is the short-run vision. The structural framework means being a social, political institution, U.S. relationship with Puerto Rico, colonial relationship, and so on. In the conventional cycle, economic activity fell because but you left intact the framework. The structural framework is in the same way. So basically, you have a feedback of the structural framework to reproduce an economic activity. But in a secular stagnation, you have a negative growth, and I need that. Because you have failures in this area. Our structural framework is in bad shape. So basically, secular stagnation refers to a significant transformation in the structural framework, social and cultural institution, legal frame, technology, demographic changes, relationship among countries, including the relationship with the United States, affecting the economic activity and then the economic growth. So basically, you have to restore the new structural framework in a new way. This is the difficult way because this is not an easy way to restructure our structural framework. So basically, some select feature of the secular stagnation, a decline in GNP potential. You have a high speculation in world savings. You have a high debt output ratio. You had lack of investment in the economy, the lack of investment in education and infrastructure, and a slowdown in the population growth and the composition of the population. Let's go to Puerto Rico and let's look the symptom. Puerto Rico have the same thing: low and negative economic growth, declining potential growth, low capital investment, high ratio of public debt to national GNP, high external service for speculation, financiarization, they call, population decline, and a net outflow of migration. Let's see some picture. Remember, I am an economist. I couldn't live without a couple of graphs, sorry. This is a comparison between different recessions. You see the 1980s, which was really, this one. The 1990s recession, which is very short. 2000, this is the green one. But this one is our current recession. We overpassed the threshold of 10% decline, and over 30 months, we have more than 1,000 months in economic decline. This is the historical real GNP growth of Puerto Rico from 1950 to current days. As you see, in the 50 and the 60, Puerto Rico grew from 7 to 10%. Very strong growth after Second War. Here we have some recession, but the economy still recovering. Right now, you have a long depression, secular stagnation, and these are the forecasts of the Federal Oversight Board, and including the fiscal plan. I'm gonna make more clear this picture. According to the current fiscal plan, for the year 2018 or 2019, the economy will be declining at 4.34%. We only recover in a positive manner in 2025. I said before. Of course, we have to take on serious that the forecast they're gonna get. ¿Se fue? Esto se apagó. But it's here. Okay. Basically, Puerto Rico is not responding to the economy of the United States. You see, in this area, the line, the blue line is the U.S. real GDP growth, and the bar, orange bar, is Puerto Rico real growth. They move in tandem, they move together. They have a high correlation, of course. But right now, it's on the way around. The United States is growing 2-3%, but Puerto Rico is go down. The ratio on investment and fixed capital is awful. You see, in 1999, we had 30% of GNP. Right now, we have only 11.8% of GNP, the investment, real investment. Investment in machinery, equipment, expanding the construction. You see, we have before a strong recession, but never compare with these figures. The same happened to the real investment. You have low interest rate, prime rate fell down, but the economy, the investment is no longer positive sensitive to that decrease in the rate of interest. So this is my forecast. If we want to increase at 3% from a period of 5 years, we need to invest 119 billions for that amount. If we want to increase at 5%, we need to increase or to invest 169.1 billions during that period. The question is, do we have money? Public investment, public debt versus GNP. GNP is growing, but public debt grew rapidly, and right now it's 1-to-1. Previous one, before 2006, the ratio was 66% debt over the GNP. So there is no way in Puerto Rico can get rid of all of this mess only with a board for a year in the only looking for close the gap between revenue and expenditure. The same happened to the number establishment in Puerto Rico, and the same happened to the employee salaries is growing 1 billion down. Puerto Rico, this is a second variable very important. This is the first time in the history of Puerto Rico that we had a fall in the population of Puerto Rico. The population fell 400,000 since 2004. And this graph is really a migration to the United States. The green line is the population goes to United States to Puerto Rico. They return it. And the outflow migration, you see the gap is. So what is, I did this calculation, net migration from 2009 to 2015 has implied economic losses. GNP fell down by 3 billion due to this migration process. Means 0.43% of GNP figures. Income, 2.8 billion, means 11.6% of the figures on 2016. Consumption, meanwhile. And revenue collection had dropped also. So what are the policies that we should follow, given that we have secular stagnation? I have no answer. Remember, I am an economist. I have many arguments and few. I try to make some policy. Let's go to what they do in International Monetary Funds. The International Monetary Funds imposes restriction, but also provide technical consultation and credit to bridge the fiscal gap. Professor Arturo Estrella, who is a Puerto Rican who teaches in Rensselaer, has said that they have a quid pro quo. Quid pro quo means I bring you and you bring me back. International Monetary Fund imposes financial restriction to distressed economy. Great. Everybody knows that. Second, an overview protocol in accordance between the official of the International Monetary Funds and the government. Third, to provide technical assistance. And the last one, make arrangement to bring the sources of direct and indirect credit to bridge the fiscal rehabilitation. We haven't had that from the US Congress. We only have one part, the responsibility, but never close the gap using some kind of policy like that. Of course, Puerto Rico, in a secular stagnation process, should promote small and medium-sized projects to promote equitable development and public investment. That means usually in Puerto Rico we think on big train, a big project. No, forget about that. We need small project in the community to grow with this project. Instead of focus on growth, focus on distribution of income. Strategy should be focused on the economy facing the small rate of growth. We have to tolerate small rate of growth, less than one. but increasing the net economic welfare and the income distribution indicators. We have to change the focus. Instead of huge problems, we have huge problems, of course, huge project, and my sugar is going down. Third, to allocate funds from the moratoria savings. We have to look some moratoria savings, we don't pay, okay, but we have to use that funds in order to finance some high value project of social benefit. Maybe to set up perpetual funds from financial, social, and physical infrastructure projects. These are another to stop population decline by reverting out migration. Well, technology. We don't need that. All these people go back to Puerto Rico, especially in the old physician. Physicians usually come from Puerto Rico, but they have connecting Puerto Rico via Sky and via technology. They are doing the business because I was talking about a friend of mine who is from Cabo Rojo, Padilla, who is right now in Texas. But he go back to Puerto Rico 2-3 times per year. And they also, he has been consulting using Skype. So due to the new technology, you don't have to in situ to bring because this is a brain drain. So knowledge can flow internationally. To accelerate investment in technology advance and innovation direct to the local establishment. Design measures to reduce inequality, aiming to increase the labor share in the distribution, consisting by increasing productivity and to expand aggregate demand. Design a public investment program to repair, maintain, and remodel the infrastructure right now. You don't need to create more infrastructure, but we have had a lot of infrastructure damage. So try to remodel, try to re-engineer. To assist a portion of funds of public debt restructuring to finance the above financial investment program. This is a very idealistic way. We have a partner, United States. I don't know if it's a partner. Let's try to believe. Let's suppose that it's a partner. Let's try to incorporate in an alliance to progress, just as the United States did in previous years. Of course, previous year with the Cold War. We are not longer in that. So the partnership responsibility entails an aid to fix the institutional structural damage inflicted by the economic growth process in Puerto Rico. They did. Legal institution, mysterious exclusion of Puerto Rico government from U.S. bankruptcy. So this is a partner. So we should go to them and say, hey, you damaged me, pay me. The U.S. government should provide equitable treatment to Medicare and Medicaid benefits to people and healthcare providers to Puerto Rico due to this alliance. So we have a lot of examples of financial sponsorship of the United States to Latin American countries. In 1989, Reagan was the president, Ronald Reagan, and they have a debt bond in the Latin American countries. I remember quite well. The U.S. Treasury imposed Brady. Brady was the chief executive of the U.S. Treasury, and they create a Brady bond, a dollar-denominated sponsor U.S. Treasury. They don't have to bring money. They only change the rules of the bonds. In 1995, the same happened. U.S. organized a bailout to Mexican Treasury. Remember the efecto tequila, tequila effect. So United States bailout Mexico with 21 billion, and they pay already 2 years later. So there are many examples right now. Ukraine, we have an executive summer, an executive from Ukraine. The director of the board. What is the salary, Rim? Over $500,000. 6. Yes, ¿verdad? But also they have expenses. They have to go each month to Kiev. They live in Kiev, and we pay for that. No United States, no the fiscal board. We, the people of Puerto Rico, pay for that. Yes, people of the fiscal board. So there is no way. So basically, another possibility policy is the Puerto Rico Economic Development Department is taking advantage of modern communication. They have been emphasized that. Should establish a program to form a network or exchange discovery from innovation among Puerto Rican scientists and artists in outside Puerto Rico as a base for domestic project development. For example, the Puerto Rico Science and Technology and Research Trust and the particularly its network program Puerto Rico Science, actively developed by a prominent Puerto Rican, Dr. Daniel Colon Ramos, Associate Professor in Neuroscience at Yale University. So we have to connect our science and technology research with all this mess. Final words. In ideal way of manner, thinking as a Puerto Rican, we need a good neighborhood, goodwill alliance. As Federal Roosevelt said in 1933, they have to look with respect Puerto Rico. Hopefully, will be that way. Thank you very much.
Well, there's a lot to think about and a lot to ask about. We have some time left before we leave, so we have time for questions. And I invite your questions at this moment to any and all of our panelists.
I have a question for Jorge, because you asked a question about what are the residual interests of the U.S. in Puerto Rico, but I don't think you gave an answer. So do you have an answer to that?
Alice in the Wonderland?
No, the thing is that to me, I don't know if someone has any other information, the U.S. has no major military and strategic interests left in Puerto Rico. And also it sees no threat to its security coming from the Caribbean. Because not even, look at what's happening in Venezuela. Venezuela is not even a competitor. And in the case of Cuba, the US and Cuba are the best of enemies now. And the cruise ships go to Havana, and that will continue this honeymoon. So there's no threat from Latin America in general, because the populist governments are having trouble to stay in power. So not even politically there's a challenge in Latin America. The US is looking at other regions. First, it looked at Central Europe. It put a lot of money in Ukraine. So it's not that the Congress doesn't have money. The US economy is growing. They put money where they feel they have a strategic interest. For example, they put a lot of money in Israel. But they don't see that in the case of Puerto Rico. And I agree with what Alameda said. Congress could do a lot to put Puerto Rico back on the road to growth. But what it could do costs money. and they don't want to spend money in Puerto Rico. That's what I feel. They haven't approved the bailout. They are not approving more federal funds. They did not provide any substitute to 936 because perhaps 936 was not functioning well, but it was something. Perhaps it benefit more the corporations than Puerto Rico, but it was an instrument it was a subsidy for investment. And the problem, I think, what Alameda has underlined is where will capital come from for investment? It has to come either from internal sources, from public capital, or from private capital. And unless there is some mechanism for growth, the situation will continue. But I don't see any major, to answer your question briefly, major strategic interests of the U.S. in Puerto Rico now.
About beyond strategic interest,
Okay.
it might be for you and both,
Okay.
Jose. Any residual economic interest, for example, in the retail industry, the creditors themselves, the market, Puerto Rico as a market, are there any significant residual economic interests that the U.S. would like to preserve?
Economic interest.
Okay.
Well, Puerto Rico right now is moving from the manufacturing sector and to the construction sector to some areas, for example, aeronautic. I have done some study for the area of Aguadilla, and the Lufthansa models and the cluster of aeronautic cluster has been increasing and have been improving in this area. But only is very centralized in the area of Aguadilla. Aguadilla is growing, the area of Aguadilla is growing because you have some cluster in this area. So let's try to make in this way. Also, you have cluster maybe in the health cluster. Mayagüez, for example, you have some cluster in the increasing the number of physicians around, specialists, and also you have a lot of clinics. Educational background also in cluster in Mayagüez. We have not only the University of Puerto Rico, the University Católica, we have also Antioch College from the Adventista, the religious sector. And we have people from Costa Rica studying in that university. From Cuba, we have also people. So maybe Puerto Rico has to decentralize the economic growth into areas. As I said before, I never wrote down here, but Gonzalez and myself, we have been doing some research about what we should do in the economic development process. But we need capital.
Also, Puerto Rico in the maritime field has lost many opportunities, exploiting the maritime routes. And what has happened with Roosevelt Roads Naval Station is terrible because there was an infrastructure there which would have been available for economic development of Puerto Rico, and it has been completely abandoned and lost. There were many millions of dollars invested in that base. It has an airport, it has roads, it has a very important port. So I don't doubt that there are potential areas for growth in Puerto Rico.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentations, and the previous panel as well was very stimulating. I would like to consider the paradigm shift that Professor Rodriguez-Lerroux suggests, and think of aspects that I don't think we've discussed enough. The situation of Puerto Rico geopolitically, not exclusively in relation to the United States, its laws, and its economics, but rather Puerto Rico in a different type of context, where it looks more towards Latin America or more towards Spain, and where politically it claims a certain identity that is not subjected to U.S. laws. I wonder, and I would love to have Jorge Duani here, to think of the impact that the diaspora will have in this type of legal configuration, but also a certain juridical identity for not only the people of Puerto Rico, but Puerto Ricans, not exclusively cited in the island. So when we think of the lack of political representation in Congress, we can think of that Puerto Ricans do have political representation in Congress, just not Puerto Ricans elected by the people of Puerto Rico in Puerto Rico. Or the representation we have within certain legal circles, like the fact that there is a Puerto Rican in the Supreme Court of the United States. So in that regard, can we think of a future where this type of transnational situation with massive representation in the United States may have an impact so that Puerto Rico will have some sort of standing, equal standing, like as if it were a nation with a certain degree of sovereignty beyond its just simple colonial status? Is that possible? Also, thinking of economic growth, will remittances, so Puerto Rico acts as a colony of the United States, we don't necessarily think of remittances. But if we consider Puerto Rico a sovereign nation, then we could see an economic growth connected to remittances from the mainland, as if it were a different nation. I don't know if that rings a bell or incites some type of prediction.
I think that the relationship with the diaspora has been completely neglected. Puerto Rico has given no importance. If you look at Dominican Republic, the Dominicans have American citizenship, Dominican citizenship, and they vote in the elections for the Dominican Republic. But that is constitutionally an abomination when you discuss it in Puerto Rico, that Puerto Ricans in the United States could elect representatives to the Puerto Rican legislature. Why not? That's what they have done in the Dominican Republic to connect the diaspora to Dominican Republic. So definitely, I agree with you. That would be a very important point, how to develop that relationship. And you mentioned it, it could be a tremendous economic asset to Puerto Rico. And also you mentioned Spain and Mexico. Both countries have important investments in Puerto Rico. Brazil could have been a future partner for Puerto Rico, but the Brazilian economy is in shambles. And also, Puerto Rico must look at China.
Right,
China is investing a lot of money in the Latin America and the Caribbean, and that relationship with China has to develop. With Russia, is going to be more difficult. But with China, apparently, Trump took him to his house in Florida, so Xi Jinping. So.
Turn off the radio, please.
The president of Ecuador was here last year.
Okay.
And he told me that there are now 4 representatives in the Ecuadorian Congress that are elected by expatriates, by Ecuadorians who live externally to the
They
country.
just had the elections here in New Haven, both the regular election and the runoff election.
Yeah. But that is, if you mention that in Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican political elite doesn't accept any participation of Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico. They say they should not vote in plebiscites, they should not vote in the government, and that is a very short-sighted view of immigration community in the U.S.
Usually, politicians in Puerto Rico, they believe that you solve the problem
by the statehood, or by independence, or by free association. This is not true. This is the way they think, and it's very difficult to get rid of this mind in Puerto Rico because everybody follow the leader. Everybody know. Many people follow leaders.
The question here.
Thank you. Kind of double-headed question, first on the political side and the economic side. Clearly, there are limitations in our status condition as this monstrosity that is the Estado Libre Asociado. And as very well Dr. Rodriguez would have quoted from Alice in Wonderland, we won't go anywhere unless we move. We will go somewhere if we move. What does Dr. Alameda, as an economist, think that the best economic option for Puerto Rico status-wise is? More independence, and looking to partners outside of the United States, getting more sovereignty, more ability, more flexibility through a treaty of free association with the United States while claiming our sovereignty, full annexation. And my other question, more on the economic side, with the flaws of the desarrollismo, the dependent capitalism, should we try and revive that, or should we try and fix its flaws, starting with the substitutable industries on the island itself, and try and rebuild something better from the ashes?
Well, the question is very exciting because I will never be objective. Will never be. I support the Free State Association. You know, I believe that statehood is not for us. We are a nation. We basically are different from the United States, different culture. We are not the United States. We are in the United States because they want. Estado Libre Asociado is an instrument that they create for themselves. So that is very difficult to understand, is the United States going to bring the statehood to Puerto Rico when Puerto Rico is broke? Puerto Rico is broke because the main political parties of Puerto Rico supported the United States, Populares and PNP. Those supporting the relationship with the United States are those who broke Puerto Rico. And because Puerto Rico is also a corruption, they have a lot of corruption between all these two parties. Then basically, many of the people in Puerto Rico, only 20% speak fluently English, including myself, who not speaks English fluently. I was there in some place 30 years ago, but I don't speak English fluently. So it's very difficult to realize that the United States will someday bring into the state Puerto Rico. This is my concern. You support statehood?
I would say that I would recommend that you read the economic report of the Status Commission of 1966, that people have forgotten about that. And that economic report said that in 25 years, Puerto Rico could be admitted as a state if it maintained the same rate of growth that states of the United States. That's what the report said. And that was 50 years ago. And the rate of growth of Puerto Rico is negative. So I wonder who's going to accept Puerto Rico as a state. It's very difficult to imagine. And also, as he showed it, the perspective for the next 10 years are of a downslide in the economy, because the fiscal board has said that for things to get better, they must get worse, you know? And we are in Wonderland. Because what political system can endure that tells the people that they need to spend 10 years in a crisis before there is growth again. The situation of Puerto Rico is very complicated.
Because they are doing the thing in the way, in the
Yeah,
different way
I agree
around.
with the argument.
Yeah, because first they have to look economic growth, sustainable economic growth, and then to try to fix revenue and close the gap. And
But the discussion in the last years, and I don't know if you would agree, has been about the fiscal crisis. There has been little discussion about economic strategy and economic development. That is not discussed. And I am not an economist, but I would like to know how is growth going to be developed in Puerto Rico again? On what can an economy be based, be it independent or state? Because if Puerto Rico becomes a state, it will have to pay federal taxes. With what will it pay federal taxes? It needs to have some wealth for it to pay federal taxes. And what the fiscal plan says is that the government of Puerto Rico is going to be shrunk. They say it's right sizing, but in fact it's downsizing radically the size of the government of Puerto Rico. But how will growth happen? That's what I don't see discussed.
The Center of New Economy is working on a plan, a strategic plan. They hire Stiglitz, Joseph Stiglitz, and also Catalá is working with them, Bobonis, Guillermo Bobonis. They are, I don't know what happened to...
Do they have a voice in the government?
No. They are independent. Center of New Economy is independent from government.
I was very interested and very convinced, Professor Alameda, by your analysis of the pro-cyclical policies that the Oversight Board is imposing, which have nothing to do with economic growth. They don't care about economic. This is like a fire sale. And you mentioned the role of the IMF. It's true that the IMF, when it signs conditionality agreements with countries, it provides resources to help them close the fiscal gap. On the other hand, those agreements are a product of a negotiation between an international financial institution and a sovereign government. This is though the IMF has gone in and taken over the government of a country and is just taking out what it needs. It's always a tension between the IMF and the sovereign governments. The IMF wants to get the resources back to wants to pay the debt, and the country wants to grow, and what comes out of those agreements is a kind of it's a product of bargaining, and the situation is completely perverse in this way. I thought there was a disconnect in your presentation because it was very persuasive that the only real way to solve the problem is to reinstitute economic growth. But then when you got to the prescriptions, it sort of became, we're going to have to put up with some very, very low level of growth, which I think is realistic, but it doesn't seem like, it seems as though the real way to be thinking about this is, first of all, get out of this terrible political straitjacket which the United States has become. I was completely persuaded and also so depressed by Gautier's analysis that the United States doesn't have any interest in, it's just a fire sale. That's all it is right now. And once that can be solved, and God knows how that's going to happen, then you're looking at other parts of the world as sources of capital and as trade partners. So that's how Latin America has gotten into this, right? They made a lot of money. Peru, Argentina, Brazil, they're not doing well now, but Chile, the East Asia has become a market for goods. Now, obviously, that's mostly commodities, and it seems like this island of concrete maybe is well positioned to become a commodity exporter. But it seems like you're completely right that this is not there's no solution to the actual economic problems of the island. It's just a fire sale at this point. That's the way they're treating it.
Okay. You're right.
I was wondering along the lines of the question that was asked earlier about the diaspora, if there have been any economic analysis of how much the Puerto Ricans that have moved to Puerto Rico are contributing to the U.S., and if that could be used as a political argument to argue maybe some of the, like I'm wondering, like the U.S. must have benefited economically from the huge immigration of Puerto Ricans. If you were to calculate how much the federal government is receiving annually in taxes by that immigration that they have gotten, and if could you make a political argument that would be more palatable about decreasing that amount back in Puerto Rico? Because I'm surprised by, because the conversations many times sound like I mean the framing is the right framing, and it's actually very the forecast is very negative, but those graphs that show the Puerto Rican decrease, you know, they're people that are not like jumping into the ocean and drowning. They're coming here for the most part, and could that be leveraged in some way?
You mean that graph?
Exactly. So that graph. So that net, so what is the economic impact of that net increase that you're showing there, and can that be leveraged in some way? Like when we talk about leveraging it, we usually talk politically, but economically, can an argument be made?
They have made this type of argument. Usually in Puerto Rico, I sponsor and I have been consulting by many groups that came here to Puerto Rico, and we use the same frame, the same arguments that, hey, listen, Congress, you receive Puerto Ricans, and they bring you back salaries, and they are contributing to they are physicians, they are scientifics here, but they don't bother. They don't have, nothing happened. They receive the information, okay, oh great, right, Puerto Rican, I love them, oh my God, very cute, but nothing happened. Including that many Puerto Ricans have been served in the military in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, Iraq. They are using that phrase, words, they are using those words, nothing happened.
Diaspora. A couple of things. One is, Victoria was just saying, a lot of the people who are going back, the Puerto Ricans that are going back to Puerto Rico, they're going there to retire, right?
Maybe.
It's not like they're going there to invest, to set up, you know, factories, whatever. But the other is, I haven't heard too many people talk about the rich Anglos that are being drawn into Puerto Rico. I'm thinking, you know, it's not just that Puerto Rican are outflowing, but they're replacing the population. So what can you say about that? With all these rich condos and multi-million dollar condos and so forth, and attracting Anglos to come in and essentially do what Santana did with the U.S. when they came into Texas and so forth, is to say, you know, you swear allegiance to the U.S. flag. Well, here, you know, you're going to be a resident of Puerto Rico. What do you talk about? Because that, to me, is just as important as the other stuff that's going on.
As far as I know, in terms of there is not a big flow of Anglos to Puerto Rico. What the Puerto Rican government has tried to do is to attract millionaires.
Right.
And some millionaires are going to Puerto Rico because they have tax
Free.
very
Low.
tax exemption, you know, and they're but I doubt that as a strategy of economic development. You don't get economic development by attracting a few millionaires. But there's no substitution of population because there's no, let's say Puerto Rico were growing and there was a lot of wealth creation, it would attract a lot of migrants. But that is not happening. In fact, Dominican immigration to Puerto Rico has reduced. So the ones that are going back to Puerto Rico are Puerto Ricans, not as many as are leaving. I don't have the exact figures, but I think there are about 20,000, no, that come back every year or something.
Puerto Rican to Puerto
Coming
Rico?
back to Puerto Rico.
Coming back, well, more or less.
You have
Yeah, those.
This is one year, 2,500,000. But for 10 years, maybe.
If I may dovetail on some of these discussions, it is interesting. It may not be a massive pattern, but it is interesting to see many young people returning to Puerto Rico, and you have certain enclaves that become, let's say, some sort of cultural remittance of a certain manifestation of a certain indie, let's say, culture of the United States in Puerto Rico, like in the Santurce area. In the early 21st century, 2001, 2, there was a New Eureka Manifesto, to which I think people like Angel Quintero signed on, and it had the intention of creating a swath of land that connected the old San Juan with Santurce, to create some sort of corridor of culture, of new energy, and there were many young people who...
And something has happened.
And something massive has happened.
You have the bookshop ACE, and there's cultural activity in that area of Santurce.
Beyond the murals.
Yeah.
Including, you receive a lot of basketball players, Dalmau, Nestalí Garcia, and many of them that are now placing in Puerto Rico, and they live in Puerto Rico. Not Nestalí, but they are in California. But Dalmau and his sons also live in Puerto Rico.
Right,
so they stay there.
So there is that type of exchange that is impacted by the diaspora. And in addition to that, there is massive political representation, not only in Congress, but also in state capitals like in Hartford, Connecticut. For a long while, there was a Puerto Rican mayor. There are council people which act as political representatives. And this I am borrowing from an argument by Edwin Melendez and the Center for Puerto Rican Studies that has been actively studying this type of relationship. So I just want to add that to the discussion.
I'm afraid that in order to solve this problem, the United States has to do something. If they want to incorporate us as a statehood, as a state of the United States, go ahead. But they are not doing nothing. If what I'm doing is a current fiscal board that do not solve anything, I don't know. I'm getting crazy.
And then we have to call it the night.
We can continue the
Or we can
discussion.
discussion later.
There are a lot of questions.
No, just very briefly to his point over there in regards to the Anglos or what have you. It might not be. I mean, I would agree with your point. It might not be perhaps in terms of population or substitution of the population, but what you are having is the taking up of space, right? Because you have Paulson buying all these empty lots and stuff, and Condal and Santurce and whatnot. So as people are getting, as we saw in the presentations in the first panel, as people are losing their homes and losing their property and such, you got all these multimillionaires that are coming in by way of these laws that are buying up these prime real estate and whatnot. And the other thing, very briefly, that I wanted to say in regards to the diaspora island relations and such, in regards to the political aspect and political Puerto Rican politicians on the mainland and their relationship with the island, it's a little bit, a little problematic, because I'm thinking, there's always the thing that of the main politicians, like Hillary and Obama and the such, and they come in their campaigns and they come to Puerto Rico and they stay for 6 hours and they get their money. There's something similar. I mean, I don't want to. It's a somewhat unjust comparison, but something similar happens with certain prominent Puerto Rican politicians on the mainland in their relationships when they come to the island. They might not be looking for money, pero tú sabes, Benita Mark Viverito and the such, and Luis Gutierrez and the such, and they come for a type of cultural validation, and they participate in anti-junta or anti-promesa things, but then they back up people that back up the junta. So it's complicated.
I just wanted to make a quick comment because the diaspora is I think that when we talk about Puerto Rico's recovery, the diaspora must be part of the equation. There's no question about it. And there are a couple of things happening. There is an organization that its name is Comprometidos. I don't know if you've seen it. And what they're doing is precisely gathering, creating these huge networks of Puerto Rican professionals throughout the mainland. In order, not necessarily only to bring and to discuss social and cultural issues, but also from the business side, from professional connections, and that's I would say that it's good. And another thing is that, of course, the economy is going and performing badly, but there are people that, in fact, they're having a blast in Puerto Rico. Some because they're making a lot of money because of the crisis, but there are other people that, despite the crisis, decided to move forward. For example, we have now companies that are incredibly successful, and they wouldn't dare to export until they were faced with the situation that their native market, that Puerto Rico market, couldn't bear any more revenues to the companies. So now we have companies exporting to Brazil, to the Middle East. I've known an architect that is providing services, architecture and engineering services to the Middle East, to one of the governments over there. And these companies are performing really well. They're there, they want to remain and keep their operations there, and what they're doing is that they're looking for other Puerto Ricans so they can just go ahead and try to promote those companies. And in that sense, I think that that's part of the solution. You know, I know that maybe we could be too pessimistic, but that's also something of optimism there.
I wanted to just comment something about the agency that Danielle actually emphasized in her presentation. And I think maybe it's in a positive note. There's some positive, I would say, examples of this movement that many of the cases actually you mentioned, and Ariadna too in her presentation. And also we wanted to mention the new political alliances that are, I think there's some fragmentation of the homogeneity of the traditional political parties in Puerto Rico, at least that's my perception, and also the important political activists in the environmental area that are really responding to this effort to sell many of the good lands that we have in Puerto Rico, including the Corredor of Luquillo, and many of the lands that are even part of the federal, how do you call it, natural?
The National Park of
Exactly.
Fideicomiso.
So, you know, that they're protected and they're responding to that. So, you know, I think that it's also going to be, because we can, what I think that is important to recognize in this scenario is that one of the proposals can be to sell some things, but what are you going to sell and in what conditions and who's going to be affected by that? So I think it's something that we have to take into
Much to think about, and I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank the organizers, and let's give them a big round of applause.